In the year 1243, at the Abbey of Saint-Martin in the verdant valleys of Burgundy, Brother Anselm tends to the fish ponds with the same patient devotion he brings to all his work. The water mirrors the autumn sky, and the monastery's ancient fish ponds, fed by clear streams and carefully managed for centuries, await his daily attention. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a medieval abbey in the year 1243, where we will follow Brother Anselm through the gentle rhythms of caring for the fish ponds that sustain his monastic community. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Brother Anselm was 51 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying brown hair that the hood of his habit could never quite conceal. He moved through the abbey grounds with the unhurried grace of a man who had spent half a century in service to these waters, these stones, these quiet rhythms that shaped the days of the monastery. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth and algae, not unpleasant, but rich and ancient, the smell of water that had known 1,000 seasons. He stood at the edge of the largest pond, his fingers trailing through the water, feeling its familiar coolness against his skin. The surface rippled gently where he touched it, each concentric circle spreading outward like the slow expansion of prayer itself. The fish ponds had been constructed by the abbey's founders more than a century before Anselm's birth. 3 ponds existed in careful arrangement, the highest for breeding, the middle for fattening, and the lowest for storage during the winter months when the fish would be needed for the monastery's table. This arrangement was old knowledge, passed down through generations of brothers who understood that the care of fish was as much a spiritual practice as any labor performed within the stone walls of the abbey. Anselm began his morning work by checking the wooden gates that controlled the flow of water between the ponds. These gates, simple and ingenious, had been constructed from timber cut nearly 30 years before, wood so weathered now that it felt almost like stone beneath his fingers. He tested each gate's movement, listening for the soft sound of water adjusting to the subtle changes in flow. The motion was smooth, as it had been every morning for decades. The sun was climbing higher now, casting amber light across the water's surface. Anselm paused for a moment, watching how the light transformed the pond into something that seemed almost not of this world, a mirror holding all the warmth of the morning sky. His hands, despite their years of work, remained steady. His breathing followed the natural rhythm of his movements, unhurried and deep. He moved next to the feeding area, where he maintained a small wooden structure for storing the bread and grain that would nourish the fish. The bread came from the abbey's own kitchens, loaves that had become too old or dense to serve the brothers at table, yet still possessed enough substance to sustain the creatures in the water. Nothing was wasted in the abbey's careful economy. Everything moved in its proper circle. Anselm selected several pieces of bread from the storage shelf, noting with quiet satisfaction how dry and well-preserved they remained in this cool, sheltered space. The scent here was different, more familiar to the abbey's other spaces, the warm, yeasty aroma of grain and thyme. He held the bread pieces in his palm for a moment, feeling their weight and texture, understanding in that small gesture the complete cycle of the monastery's life. Walking to the feeding platform that extended slightly into the water, Anselm began to crumble the bread into smaller pieces. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the same motion he had performed thousands of times before. As the pieces fell into the water, he heard the soft sounds of the fish responding, the gentle disturbance of their movement beneath the surface. The water around the platform erupted into quiet activity. The carp, dark shapes that became visible as they rose to feed, created small circles of disturbance. They were substantial creatures, some growing to the length of a man's forearm, and they moved with an ancient intelligence that Anselm had long since learned to respect. He watched them with the attention of someone observing a familiar friend going about their daily work. The autumn afternoon had begun its slow descent toward evening when Anselm moved to the lowest pond, the storage pond where fish were kept during the winter months when the higher ponds would freeze. This pond was deeper than the others, fed by a constant spring that maintained its temperature even in the coldest months. The water here was remarkably clear, and Anselm could see to a considerable depth, watching the shadows of larger fish moving slowly in the cool depths. He settled himself on a flat stone at the pond's edge, his reddened hands folded in his lap. The texture of the stone beneath him, worn smooth by years of use, was deeply familiar. He began to hum, a plain chant melody that had been part of the Abbey's liturgy for longer than anyone could remember. The melody seemed to carry across the water, reflecting back from the gentle slopes that surrounded the pond. As he sat in the deepening afternoon light, Anselm considered the small tasks that remained before evening prayers. There was inspection to be done, examining the banks to ensure no damage had occurred, checking the small channels that directed water flow, observing the condition of the fish themselves. These tasks were not demanding, yet they held a profound importance. They were the work of stewardship, the careful attention that kept the ponds, and through the ponds the entire monastery, alive and sustained. The temperature had shifted perceptibly since morning. A breeze moved across the water, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, the smell of autumn deepening. Anselm rose slowly from his stone and began to walk along the bank, his footsteps measured and thoughtful. His eyes moved across the water's surface, noting everything: the quality of the light, the movement of fish beneath, the condition of the surrounding vegetation. Near the overflow channel, where excess water was carefully directed back to the stream that fed the ponds, Anselm paused to observe. The water flowed smoothly here, the channel he himself had helped to deepen and maintain now functioning with perfect efficiency. He knelt carefully, his joints moving with the deliberate care of age, and felt the water with his work-reddened hand. It was cool and clear, flowing with steady purpose. The simple integrity of this work filled him with a contentment that was wordless and complete. There was no complexity here that required solving, no mystery that demanded unraveling. There was only the clear and direct relationship between effort and result. The ponds were cared for, the fish were nourished, the water flowed in its proper channels. The monks of the abbey would have protein in winter because of what he did in autumn. The future was being tended in the present moment. By the time the bells for evening prayers had begun to ring across the monastery grounds, Anselm had completed his daily work. The fish ponds were settled and calm, the water level maintained, the fish fed and observed. He made his way toward the cloister with the same unhurried pace he brought to all his movements, his mind already beginning the internal shift that would carry him from the work of the ponds to the work of prayer. The evening air had grown notably cooler now, and he could feel the slight chill touching the exposed skin of his face and neck. Yet the coldness was pleasant, refreshing. It seemed to clarify his senses and deepen his awareness of the moment. His breathing remained slow and steady as he walked through the monastery's passages, his footsteps creating familiar echoes in the stone corridors. Brother Anselm made his way through the cloister after evening prayers, his body moving with the particular weariness of satisfied labor. The stone corridors of the abbey seemed to hold the day's warmth within their ancient walls, and as he walked, the scent of candle wax and incense mingled with the lingering smell of earth that clung to his habit. The refectory had grown quiet by the time he arrived for the evening meal. Most of the brothers had already eaten, but Brother Cuthbert, the kitchener, had left a portion of pottage warming near the fire, a courtesy extended to those whose duties kept them occupied through the usual meal times. The pottage was thick with barley and herbs, seasoned with a subtle warmth that suggested dried mustard seed had been added. Anselm settled onto the long wooden bench and ate slowly, tasting each spoonful with full attention. As he ate, he became aware of Brother Thomas, the youngest member of the community, sitting several places distant. Thomas was perhaps 20 years old, his face still bearing the uncertain expression of one newly arrived to monastic life. The boy, for Anselm still thought of him as a boy, despite his adult years, had been assigned to assist with various tasks around the abbey, and occasionally he helped Anselm with heavier work around the fish ponds. Anselm observed without seeming to observe. He noticed how Thomas held his wooden spoon with insufficient confidence, how his eyes occasionally strayed toward the windows where the last light of day was fading. The boy was still learning what it meant to find peace in the rhythms of monastic work. Anselm remembered this state, though it had been decades since he himself had occupied it. The evening was settling into that particular quality of autumn darkness where the world seemed to contract, becoming smaller and more intimate. Anselm finished his pottage and set the empty bowl aside with deliberate care. His movements remained measured, unhurried. This deliberation itself was a form of prayer, a way of bringing mindfulness to even the simplest actions. He made his way to his cell, a small room on the eastern side of the abbey where the first light of morning would eventually find him. The cell was spare, containing only a narrow sleeping platform with a thin blanket, a small shelf holding his few possessions, and a single candle for reading during the winter months when the evenings grew long. The walls were bare stone, and the narrow window looked out toward the fish ponds. Anselm sat on the edge of his sleeping platform and removed his leather work shoes, objects as worn and familiar as his own hands. The relief of removing them was profound. His feet seemed to expand slightly, as though released from long confinement. He flexed his toes slowly, feeling the individual bones move within their socket joints, and took a moment simply to notice the sensation of freedom this small act provided. The blanket that covered his sleeping platform was made of undyed wool, rough-textured and heavy. He pulled it across his shoulders as he sat, feeling its weight settle over him like an embrace. Outside his window, the darkness had become complete. The last traces of twilight had vanished entirely, leaving only the deep blue-black of autumn night. From somewhere beyond the abbey's walls came the distant call of an owl, a sound that carried across the darkened landscape with startling clarity. Anselm listened to it without trying to identify its direction or meaning. The sound simply existed, as all things existed within God's creation, and its existence was reason enough for gratitude. His mind moved back to the fish ponds, to the work he had performed throughout the day. He thought of the carp moving in the water, their existence as removed from his own as starlight, yet connected through the careful intention he brought to their care. He thought of the water flowing in its channels, following the paths that previous generations had cut into the earth. He thought of winter coming, and the stored fish that would sustain the abbey through the months when the ponds froze solid. Sleep had not yet arrived, but Anselm was not troubled by its absence. He had learned long ago that sleep was not something to be pursued or forced, but something that came when the body and mind had been properly prepared through work and prayer. He lay back slowly onto his sleeping platform, his head finding the indentation in the blanket where his head had rested for decades. The darkness surrounding him was complete and soothing. The stone walls seemed to breathe gently around him, holding the warmth of the day and releasing it slowly into the night. His breathing began to synchronize with this invisible rhythm, becoming deeper and more measured with each passing moment. The next morning arrived as mornings always did, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the darkness transforming into gray-blue, then into the pale gold of early autumn light. Anselm had slept deeply and without disturbance. He rose from his sleeping platform while the rest of the abbey still rested, moving quietly through the dark corridors toward the fish ponds. The morning air was markedly cooler than it had been the previous day. A mist clung to the water's surface, rising in thin wisps that caught the earliest light and transformed it into something luminous and ethereal. Anselm stood at the edge of the upper pond, watching this transformation unfold. The mist carried the scent of water and earth, a smell that seemed to contain the essence of the season itself, harvest time transitioning toward winter. His work began with the smallest tasks. He checked the wooden gates again, feeling their movement, listening to the soft sound of water adjusting to his subtle manipulations. The gates responded perfectly, as they always did. His hands, work-reddened and calloused from decades of labor, moved with the confidence of absolute familiarity. By the time Brother Thomas arrived to assist him, the mist had begun to burn away under the strengthening sun. Thomas approached with the cautious respect that younger members of the community typically extended to their elders. His own hands were not yet calloused from labor, and his movements still carried the uncertainty of one still learning the rhythms of monastic work. "Good morning, Brother Anselm," Thomas said quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Anselm turned to him, and his weathered face arranged itself into an expression that combined patience with genuine welcome. "Good morning, Brother Thomas. I have work for your stronger back this morning if you are willing." The task was simple but required steadiness. One of the larger feeding platforms needed to be inspected and reinforced. The wood, though still sound, had begun to show the softening that came from constant exposure to moisture. Anselm and Thomas worked together, moving slowly, speaking rarely. The rhythm of their work, Thomas holding a piece of timber in place while Anselm examined the joints, became its own form of meditation. As they worked, Anselm found himself observing the younger man with the attention that came naturally after decades of living in a close community. Thomas was struggling, Anselm could see. There was something in the way his shoulders sometimes tensed, something in the way his eyes occasionally grew distant, that spoke of internal conflict. The boy was homesick, perhaps, or struggling with the silence that monastic life demanded. The reasons were unclear, but the struggle itself was evident. When the platform work had been completed, Anselm set down his tools and gestured toward the lowest pond. "Come," he said simply. "There is something I wish to show you." They walked along the bank together, their footsteps making soft sounds on the grass that was beginning to show the browning of autumn. When they reached the deepest pond, Anselm settled himself onto the familiar stone and indicated that Thomas should sit beside him. For a long time, neither man spoke. They simply sat, watching the water. Anselm hummed his plain chant melody softly, the notes carrying across the still surface. His work-reddened hands rested in his lap, utterly still, utterly at peace. Gradually, Anselm became aware that Thomas's breathing had slowed. The tension that had marked the younger man's movements throughout the morning had begun to ease. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, and his eyes grew softer as they tracked the slow movement of shadows beneath the water's surface. "I have been here for 2 years, Brother Thomas," Anselm said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not in the Abbey, though I have been here in the Abbey for 37 years. I mean here at these ponds, every morning, every afternoon, every season. The work is the same. The water is the same. The fish are the same and yet different and yet the same." Thomas turned to look at him, his young face attentive. "When I first came to this work," Anselm continued, "I thought I would tire of it. I thought that repetition would become tedious. But I have learned that repetition is not tedium. Repetition is the foundation of peace. Each day that I perform the same tasks, I understand them more deeply. Each season that the cycles repeat, I comprehend more fully the mind of God in these workings." Anselm paused, watching a large carp move through the deep water, its shape visible for a moment before it dissolved back into shadow. The fish do not struggle against their nature. The water does not resist its path. The seasons do not argue with their own unfolding. We alone carry resistance within ourselves. We alone believe that repetition should weary us, that familiar rhythms should bore us. But observe the ponds, Brother Thomas. They teach a different wisdom. Thomas sat in silence, his young face illuminated by the understanding that was beginning to dawn there. His hands, uncalloused and still soft from youth, lay in his lap with a new quality of quietness about them. The morning continued its slow progression toward midday. Anselm and Thomas remained by the pond, speaking rarely, simply sitting in the companionable silence that had begun to settle between them. The water's surface was now completely clear of mist, reflecting the sky with perfect fidelity. The temperature had risen slightly, and the quality of light had shifted from the pale gold of early morning to the warmer amber of mid-morning. Eventually, Anselm rose slowly from his stone, and Thomas rose with him. They walked back toward the abbey in the same unhurried manner they had come. As they entered the main buildings, Anselm placed a weathered hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of blessing and acknowledgement. The contact was brief, but its meaning seemed to resonate through the younger man's entire frame. The bells for midday prayer were beginning to ring as they made their way to the refectory. The sound of bronze and brass carried across the abbey's stone corridors, marking the passage of time with the same precision it had maintained for centuries. Anselm's breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the bells. His graying brown hair caught the light filtering through the high windows. His work-reddened hands moved with the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly where he belonged and what his labor meant. In the refectory, Brother Cuthbert had prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and thin ale. Anselm ate slowly, tasting each element with full attention. Around him, the other monks moved through their own meals with varying degrees of mindfulness, some rushing through their food, others eating with deliberate care. Anselm noticed without judgment. Each man was on his own path toward understanding. After the meal, before the afternoon work began, Anselm made his way to the scriptorium where Brother William, the monastery's primary scribe, labored over his manuscripts. The scriptorium was a place of profound silence, broken only by the soft scratching of quills and the occasional sound of a page being carefully turned. The light here was carefully controlled through narrow windows that prevented direct sun from fatting the precious inks and dyes used in the illuminated manuscripts. Brother William was 53 years old, only 2 years younger than Anselm himself, and his face bore the marks of a man whose life had been spent in close work, requiring meticulous attention. His hair was whiter than Anselm's, and his fingers, stained permanently with ink, were even more callous than Anselm's own work-reddened hands, though the callousing came from different labor. William looked up as Anselm entered, recognizing him with a quiet nod. The two men had lived in a close community for 30 years, though they seldom spoke extensively. Yet between them existed a deep understanding, the unspoken recognition of two men who knew the value of patient work done with full attention and care. "The fish are thriving," Anselm said quietly, not wishing to disturb the other scribes who were absorbed in their work. "The ponds are preparing well for winter." William smiled slightly, understanding that this simple statement carried layers of meaning. He returned his attention to his manuscript, his quill moving across the vellum with the same unhurried precision that Anselm brought to his own work at the ponds. Anselm turned to leave, then paused. He selected a fresh sheet of vellum from the stack that William maintained and examined it closely. The surface was smooth and perfectly prepared, ready to receive whatever words or illuminations William would inscribe upon it. The perfection of the preparation, the care that tanning and stretching and scraping demanded, was evident in every fiber of the material. "Your work endures," Anselm said quietly. "These words you inscribe will outlast all of us. They will be read when we are dust." William looked up again, and his weathered face arranged itself into an expression of gratitude. "As will your fish feed those who come after us," he replied. "We are both engaged in the work of continuity, Brother Anselm. The form differs, but the essence is identical. Anselm nodded slowly, feeling the profound truth of this observation settle into his bones. He left the scriptorium and made his way back toward the fish ponds. The afternoon was advancing, and there remained work that only he could do. The light had shifted again by the time he reached the ponds. The warmth of midday had given way to a subtly cooler quality, and the shadows cast by the surrounding vegetation had begun to lengthen slightly. Anselm moved along the banks, checking everything with his customary thoroughness. The water levels were maintained perfectly. The fish were active and healthy. The channels directing water flow between the ponds remained clear and efficient. He found himself returning frequently to the lowest pond, the deepest one where he had sat with Brother Thomas that morning. Here, the water was so clear that he could see to extraordinary depths, watching the shapes of larger fish moving in the cool darkness beneath the surface. The stillness of this pond seemed to contain something almost holy, a quality of peace that seemed to transcend the merely physical. As afternoon transformed gradually into evening, Anselm began the process of settling the ponds for the night. This ritual, performed daily for decades, involved checking each structure, ensuring no debris had accumulated in the channels, verifying that the water flow remained balanced and harmonious. His movements had become so practiced that they occurred almost automatically, his body performing the tasks while his mind existed in that state between thought and meditation. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon when Anselm completed his work. The light was turning that particular shade of amber that seemed to transform everything it touched into something precious and temporary. He stood at the edge of the upper pond and watched the light play across the water's surface, creating patterns that shifted and flowed with the subtle currents beneath. His breathing had become very slow and deep. His entire being seemed to have synchronized with the rhythm of the water, the ponds, the cycles of seasons that had shaped his life for half a century. The awareness of his own body, his work-reddened hands, his graying brown hair, his aging knees and back, all of this seemed somehow insignificant compared to the vast continuity of the work he performed. The bells for evening prayer began to ring as the light continued its slow transformation. Anselm made his way toward the abbey with unhurried steps, his body moving through the familiar pathways with the absolute certainty of a man who had walked these routes thousands of times before. That night in his cell, Anselm slept even more deeply than he had the previous evening. His dreams, if he experienced them, left no traces upon his waking consciousness. He simply existed in a state of profound rest, his body and mind recovering from the day's labor while remaining connected to the eternal cycles that moved beyond time itself. The third morning arrived wrapped in a deeper chill than the previous days. Frost had begun to paint the edges of the fish ponds with delicate crystalline patterns, and Anselm's breath formed visible clouds in the still air as he made his way from the abbey toward his work. The season is shifting noticeably now. The trees surrounding the monastery grounds had begun their transformation into autumn's full palette, golds and crimsons and deep browns replacing the lingering greens of late summer. The grass beneath Anselm's feet was heavy with dew, and the dampness seeped through his worn leather shoes, creating a small discomfort that he acknowledged without resistance. Discomfort was simply another texture of existence, another element of the day to be experienced fully and then released. At the upper pond, Anselm discovered something that required his immediate attention. A section of the bank where water flowed into the middle pond had begun to erode slightly. The careful engineering that previous generations had constructed was being tested by the particular moisture conditions of this autumn season. The erosion was minor, not yet a concern, but the kind of thing that, left unattended, could develop into a genuine problem as winter approached. Anselm knelt at the affected area, examining it with the meticulous care that characterized all his work. His work-reddened hands traced the pattern of erosion, feeling the texture of displaced earth and the subtle movement of water that was carving this new channel. The problem was clear to him, and so was the solution. He would need additional hands, and he would need materials, wood and stone, to reinforce the bank and redirect the water's flow. He found Brother Oswin in the workshops, a man younger than Anselm by perhaps 15 years, whose skills with wood and stone made him invaluable for such projects. Oswin was occupied with repairing a section of the abbey's outer wall, but he set aside his work immediately when Anselm explained the situation at the ponds. "The water is patient," Oswin observed as they made their way together toward the upper pond, "but only until it chooses not to be." The comment struck Anselm as containing a particular wisdom. They walked in companionable silence, and by the time they reached the erosion site, a plan had already begun to form in both their minds. The kind of wordless collaboration that came from years of living and working in a close community. The work required precision and patience. Oswin selected several large stones from the pile of materials maintained near the abbey's workshops. Each stone had to be positioned exactly right, not merely placed, but fitted into a particular relationship with the surrounding earth and water that would create stability and proper flow. Anselm worked alongside him, his decades of understanding about how water moved and behaved informing every decision about placement. The morning advanced, and their work continued with the same unhurried rhythm that characterized all monastic labor. Other brothers occasionally passed, and some paused to observe or assist briefly before moving on to their own tasks. The work seemed to draw people toward it. There was something inherently satisfying about watching careful attention applied to a practical problem. By midday, the bank had been reinforced with a structure of carefully positioned stones backed by earth that Anselm had tamped down with methodical care. A small wooden barrier had been constructed to guide the water's flow into its proper channel. The erosion site had been transformed from a potential problem into a reinforced section of bank that would likely endure for many years. Anselm and Oswin stood together, examining their work from several angles. Water flowed smoothly across the reinforced section now, following the path they had created for it with the same gentle inevitability it had always possessed. The integration of stone and earth and water seemed almost natural, as though the bank had always been constructed in precisely this manner. "It will hold," Oswin said simply, his voice containing the satisfaction of work completed well. "It will hold," Anselm agreed. He extended his work-reddened hand to Oswin in a gesture of gratitude. The contact was brief, but its meaning was complete. Two men had collaborated in solving a problem, and the solution would benefit not only themselves but all those who came after them. The afternoon was advancing toward evening by the time Anselm returned to the ponds alone. He moved slowly along the banks, examining how the water was flowing through the reinforced section, and how the other ponds were responding to the subtle changes he and Oswin had created. Everything appeared balanced and harmonious. The adjustments had been integrated into the system, as though they had always been part of its design. He found Brother Thomas waiting for him near the lowest pond. The young man's face bore an expression of cautious hope, and his stance suggested he had been waiting for some time, gathering courage for a particular conversation. "Brother Anselm," Thomas began, "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday, about repetition and peace. I have been thinking about it constantly." Anselm settled himself onto his familiar stone and indicated that Thomas should sit beside him. The younger man sat, his youthful frame still not entirely comfortable with the sustained stillness that Anselm inhabited so naturally. "In my family's home," Thomas continued, his voice carrying the weight of confession, "my father was a wool merchant. His days were consumed with variety, new fabrics, new traders arriving, new decisions constantly. He was often tense and his mind seemed never to rest. When I came to the monastery, I thought the simplicity would be easier. But instead, I find myself struggling against it, wanting complexity and change and novelty. I feel as though something within me is broken, Brother Anselm. The repetition feels like a prison." Anselm listened without interrupting, his entire attention focused on the younger man's words. When Thomas finished speaking, Anselm allowed a long silence to settle between them before he responded. "Your father lived in the world of constant striving," Anselm said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "His mind was always oriented toward the future, what goods might arrive, what decisions must be made, what changes might bring profit. This is the way of the merchant, and it is not wrong. It is simply a different path. But you have chosen a different way, Brother Thomas, and your struggle comes from still carrying your father's orientation within your own being." Thomas's young face was attentive, absorbing each word with the intensity of someone seeking genuine understanding. "Consider the water in these ponds," Anselm continued, gesturing toward the still surface before them. "The water does not resist its path. It does not wish for complexity. It flows downward, it is filtered, it flows upward again, it nourishes life, and then it returns to the sea. This cycle repeats infinitely, and in that infinite repetition, the water fulfills its nature completely. It is not imprisoned, it is liberated. It is only when water resists its nature that suffering arises, when it freezes against its nature, or when it is forced into artificial channels, or when it is contaminated. But water moving in harmony with its own nature, this is true freedom." "How do I achieve this harmony?" Thomas asked, his voice containing both longing and doubt. "You do not achieve it," Anselm replied. "You surrender to it. You allow your resistance to gradually diminish. Each day you perform the same tasks, you choose to approach them with full attention rather than resentment. Each time you feel the urge for novelty or complexity, you gently remind yourself that this moment, this simple moment, contains all the richness that any moment could contain. The richness is not in variety. The richness is in depth. They sat together as the afternoon light began its transformation. Anselm's humming of plain chant melodies seemed to carry some quality that was reaching into Thomas's troubled spirit, beginning to soothe something that had been raw and anxious. The younger man's breathing gradually slowed, matching the rhythm of Anselm's own breath, and the space between them seemed to fill with a quality of peace. When it came time for evening prayer, they rose and made their way back toward the abbey together. Thomas's steps were noticeably lighter than they had been that morning. His shoulders, which had carried tension throughout the day, had begun to relax. The conversation had not solved his struggle. Anselm was wise enough to understand that understanding itself could not be handed from one person to another. But something had shifted in the younger man's approach to his struggle, and that shifting was itself a form of grace. The refectory that evening contained the same meal as most other evenings, a soup thickened with beans and root vegetables, bread that had been baked the previous day, weak ale that was safer to drink than water. Anselm ate slowly and completely, tasting each component of the meal with full awareness. Beside him, Thomas was eating differently now, no longer rushing through the meal as though it were an obstacle between him and some more desirable state, but rather attending to each bite with a quality of mindfulness that suggested Anselm's words had already begun to take root. The evening hours brought a deepening cold. Autumn was advancing rapidly now, and winter was already beginning to announce its approach through the particular quality of the air and the slant of the remaining light. Anselm sat in the abbey's warming room after the evening meal, as was permitted on the coldest evenings, and felt the gentle heat from the small fire settle into his aging frame. Brother Cuthbert, the kitchener, was also warming himself by the fire, and the two men sat in the companionable silence that long acquaintance permitted. They had known each other for nearly 3 decades, and yet they rarely engaged in extended conversation. This silence was not a lack of communication. It was simply a different form of it, one that carried its own validity and depth. "The young brother is struggling," Cuthbert observed, his voice carrying no particular judgment, simply a statement of fact. "Yes," Anselm replied, "but he is beginning to understand that his struggle is not a sign of failure. It is simply the resistance that comes before surrender." "Have you helped him?" Cuthbert asked. "I have simply shown him the ponds," Anselm responded. "The ponds are teaching him if he can learn to listen." They sat in silence again, and the warmth of the fire seemed to carry away some of the day's accumulated tension. Anselm thought about the reinforced bank at the upper pond, about how the erosion had been addressed before it could become a genuine problem. He thought about the way problems, when attended to promptly and carefully, often resolved themselves into solutions that were almost elegant in their simplicity. That night, Anselm slept dreamlessly again, and in the morning he rose early as always. The frost had deepened, and the entire landscape around the monastery seemed to have transformed overnight into something crystalline and precious. The fish ponds themselves had not yet begun to freeze. The deeper waters maintained their fluidity, the constant spring feed ensuring that ice had not yet formed. But Anselm could see the edges beginning to accumulate the thin crystalline formations that would gradually thicken as the weeks progressed toward winter's full arrival. He began his morning work with the knowledge that his routine was now transitioning into its winter mode. This was not a dramatic change, but rather a subtle adjustment, small modifications to account for the changing season, preparations that would ensure the ponds and their inhabitants could survive the months of cold ahead. He checked the lowest pond more carefully now, understanding that this was the pond where the fish would eventually be gathered when the upper ponds began to freeze. The water here was noticeably deeper, and Anselm could see that the spring feed was maintaining its consistent flow. The temperature of the water remained relatively stable even as the air temperature plummeted. This pond would become a refuge, and it needed to be perfect. Brother Thomas appeared again, his movements now carrying a quality of purposefulness that had been absent before. Together, they began the work of cleaning debris from the channels and strengthening the structures that would need to endure the winter's stress. "I have been observing the ponds throughout the day," Thomas said as they worked, his voice reflecting a quality of wonder. "I have been noticing how everything changes and yet everything remains the same. The water is constantly flowing, and yet the ponds themselves maintain their essential nature. The seasons progress, and yet the rhythm of the seasons repeats. I think I am beginning to understand what you meant, Brother Anselm." Anselm paused in his work and looked at the younger man with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Thomas's face had changed noticeably in just a few days. The anxious tension had begun to ease, replaced by something that resembled peace, or at least the beginning of peace, the first glimmerings of understanding that peace was possible. "Understanding deepens through experience," Anselm said simply. "You are not simply hearing these truths with your ears, Brother Thomas. You are beginning to experience them directly. This is the only true learning." The morning advanced, and their work continued. By the time the bells for midday prayer began to ring, they had completed the cleaning and reinforcement of 2 major channels. The work they had done would help ensure that when winter came, the water would continue to flow smoothly and efficiently, maintaining the careful balance that kept the ponds and their inhabitants alive and healthy through the cold months ahead. That afternoon, Anselm spent time in the storage area near the ponds, checking the supplies that would be needed for winter. The dried bread was being accumulated carefully, stored in a space that was cool and dry enough to prevent spoilage. The grain reserves were being maintained at appropriate levels. Everything was being arranged according to a careful plan that had been refined over the decades of his stewardship. Anselm moved through this inventory with his habitual thoroughness, ensuring that nothing was missing or deteriorating. His work-reddened hands traced across containers of stored provisions, and his mind simultaneously held multiple layers of awareness. The immediate details of what was before him, the memory of previous winters when these stores had sustained the ponds and their fish, and the anticipation of winters yet to come. The quality of light in the late afternoon was becoming increasingly precious as autumn advanced. Each day, the sun set slightly earlier, and the angle of its rays changed perceptibly. Anselm had lived 51 years through these cycles, and 37 of those years had been spent observing these precise changes at the Fishponds. His understanding of seasonal progression was encoded not merely in his intellectual comprehension, but in his body itself, in the way his movements adjusted instinctively to the changing demands of each season. As evening approached, he found himself standing once again at the edge of the lowest pond, watching the water in its profound stillness. The first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky above, appearing gradually as the light continued its slow diminishment. Anselm stood without moving, his breathing synchronized with the invisible rhythm of the water itself. He thought about Brother Thomas, about the journey of understanding that the younger man had only just begun. He thought about Brother William in the scriptorium, laboriously copying words onto vellum with the same patient dedication that Anselm brought to his work with the ponds. He thought about Brother Oswin, whose skilled hands had helped reinforce the eroding bank. He thought about all the monks in the monastery, each engaged in their own form of labor, each contributing to the vast, intricate web of work that kept the abbey functioning through the cycles of seasons. All of this labor, he understood, was essentially the same labor performed in different forms. They were all tending something, whether fish or texts or stone or grain. They were all performing the work of stewardship, of maintaining and preserving and nurturing the resources that had been entrusted to their care. And in this work, performed without expectation of extraordinary recognition or reward, without seeking novelty or excitement, there existed a profound form of grace. The bells for evening prayer were beginning to ring as twilight deepened toward darkness. Anselm turned from the pond and made his way back toward the abbey, his footsteps following the familiar path with the absolute certainty of one who had walked it thousands of times. His graying brown hair was becoming visible under his hood now, and his work-reddened hands were tucked into the sleeves of his habit to preserve their warmth against the advancing chill. The refectory was warm and filled with the quiet sounds of monks completing their evening meal. Anselm took his place and ate with the same full attention he brought to all activities. The soup tonight was particularly flavorful, suggesting that Brother Cuthbert had added herbs from the monastery's stores, perhaps sage or thyme, gathered during the summer and dried for winter use. The flavor carried with it the memory of summer's warmth, and eating it was like consuming the season itself, like drawing into his body the essence of the warmer months and carrying that warmth forward into the advancing cold. After the meal, Anselm made his way to the scriptorium, where he found Brother William still laboring over his manuscripts in the candlelight. The older scribe looked up as Anselm entered, recognizing him with a subtle nod. "The ponds are preparing for winter," Anselm said quietly, not wishing to disturb the other scribes. "The season is advancing more rapidly than the last few years." "The earth moves at its own pace," William replied, his pen pausing mid-word. "We are merely observers, attempting to live in harmony with its rhythms." Anselm found himself drawn to the manuscripts William had been copying. These were texts of liturgical significance, prayers and songs that would be chanted throughout the liturgical year, the ancient words of saints and mystics that had sustained the church for centuries. The vellum was translucent in the candlelight, and the ink seemed to glow with an inner luminosity. "Your words will outlast the ponds," Anselm said, considering the aged parchment. "The texts you copy will be read centuries from now, while the water I tend will flow on without record or memory." William smiled slightly at this observation. "Perhaps," he said, "but consider this. Your work feeds the community that protects and preserves these texts. Without your labor at the ponds, there would be no fish to nourish us through winter, and without nourishment, there would be no scribes to perform this work. You are not separate from this work, Brother Anselm. You are part of its foundation." Anselm considered this perspective, finding it contained a truth that resonated deeply. The work of the scriptorium and the work of the Fishponds were not separate endeavors. They were threads in a single, vast tapestry of labor and dedication that sustained the entire monastery. He left the scriptorium and made his way through the darkening corridors toward his cell. The cold had intensified dramatically since sunset, and his breath formed clouds in the stone passages. The abbey itself seemed to be bracing for winter, preparing for the months of cold and darkness that would eventually arrive. In his cell, Anselm removed his shoes and settled himself onto his sleeping platform, drawing the rough wool blanket over his shoulders. The cell was very cold now, and he lay still, allowing his body heat to gradually warm the blanket. His mind moved through the day's events, the work on the bank, the conversation with Thomas, the observation of William's manuscripts, the simple meals that sustained him. All of it was prayer, Anselm understood. All of it was the expression of faith, not the loud, dramatic expressions that dominated more public spirituality, but the quiet, steady, daily expression of belief through work performed with full attention and care. This was the true substance of monastic life, the core that remained constant beneath all the rituals and ceremonies and communal practices. Sleep came gradually, peacefully, as it always did. And in the morning, there would be more work, more ponds to tend, more water to manage, more preparations for the winter that was advancing toward them all. The fourth morning arrived with a quality of stillness that suggested winter was drawing nearer with each passing day. Anselm woke in the deep darkness before dawn, as he always did, and lay for a moment listening to the profound quiet that surrounded the monastery. The silence was broken only by his own breathing and the distant, barely audible sound of wind moving through the stone corridors of the abbey. He rose slowly, his aging joints moving with deliberate care. The cold had penetrated deeply into the abbey's stone walls during the night, and the cell was so frigid that his breath formed visible clouds. He dressed quickly, layering wool upon wool, and made his way through the darkened passages toward the Fishponds. The landscape beyond the abbey's walls was transformed by frost. Every blade of grass, every leaf, every surface had been crystallized overnight into delicate formations of ice. The effect was almost otherworldly, the familiar surroundings rendered strange and precious by the simple addition of frozen water. Anselm moved through this transformed landscape with wonder, despite having witnessed this same transformation countless times before. At the upper pond, he found that a thin skin of ice had begun to form along the edges where the water was shallowest. The center of the pond remained open, fed by the constant flow from the spring source, but the margins were hardening. Anselm knelt at the water's edge and placed his bare hand. He had removed his glove to feel the water directly into the frigid liquid. The cold was almost shocking in its intensity, yet there was something purifying about it as well, something that seemed to clear away all unnecessary thought and perception. He withdrew his hand and watched the water droplets on his work-reddened skin begin to freeze, forming tiny, perfect crystalline structures. This transformation from liquid to solid was one of the great mysteries of creation. Anselm had always believed water possessed the capacity to exist in multiple states, yet remained essentially itself through all transformations. It was a kind of patience that transcended ordinary human understanding. Brother Oswin appeared as the first gray light began to creep across the horizon. The two men exchanged greetings without extensive conversation, and together they began to address the preparations that would occupy much of their time now until the depths of winter arrived. The work was increasingly focused on transition, moving supplies, reinforcing structures that would need to endure the weight and stress of ice and snow, gradually concentrating the living fish from the upper and middle ponds into the deepest pond, where the spring feed would maintain enough open water to sustain them through the frozen months. "This year the cold is coming earlier," Oswin observed as they worked, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. "I can feel it in my bones. It will be a hard winter." "The fish will survive," Anselm replied with quiet certainty. "They always do. Winter is simply part of the cycle. The ponds have endured harder winters than this one will be." They worked throughout the morning with the kind of efficient coordination that came from having performed similar tasks together many times before. By the time the bells for midday prayer began to ring, they had moved several large baskets of dried bread from the upper storage area to the lower storage facility near the deepest pond. This repositioning would make feeding the concentrated fish population much simpler when access became more difficult due to ice. That afternoon, Anselm found himself working alone at the ponds. He moved slowly along the banks, checking each structure, verifying that the transition preparations were proceeding according to plan. His work-reddened hands performed their tasks with the automatic precision of decades of repetition. His mind, meanwhile, existed in that state between thought and meditation that characterized his deepest periods of work. Brother Thomas appeared in the late afternoon, moving across the frozen ground with a grace that suggested he had already begun to adapt to the monastery's rhythms in a deeper way than he had been able to do just days before. The young man's face was no longer marked by the anxious tension that had characterized his first weeks. Something had shifted in his understanding. "Brother Anselm," Thomas began, his voice carrying a quality of excitement tempered by reverence, "I have been observing something all day. The way the frost forms, it follows patterns, doesn't it? It's not random. The crystals grow in specific geometric arrangements. I watched a blade of grass this morning for nearly an hour, and the ice formed around it in a pattern that seemed almost intentional." Anselm smiled at this observation. "You are beginning to see what the medieval philosophers called the divine signature in creation," he said gently. "Everything that exists bears the mark of God's intention. Nothing is truly random or accidental. Even the frost, in its seemingly chaotic beauty, expresses a profound order. They stood together, watching the light continue its slow descent toward darkness. The afternoon was becoming increasingly precious as winter advanced, each day containing fewer hours of usable daylight. "I wrote a letter to my father," Thomas continued. "I told him that I understand now why I needed to come here. I told him that his life of constant striving and change had confused me about the nature of peace. I told him that I have found something here that I never could have found in the world of merchants and trade. I don't know if he will understand, but I needed to tell him." "Your understanding is sufficient," Anselm replied. "Whether your father comprehends it is his own journey. You have honored him by explaining your path clearly. More than that cannot be expected." The evening arrived with the same steady progression it always followed, the light transforming through shades of amber and gold toward deep blue and then to darkness. The temperature continued to plummet, and by the time the bells for evening prayer rang out across the monastery grounds, the world had become so cold that breathing itself seemed like an act of deliberate will. In the refectory, Brother Cuthbert had prepared a thick, hearty soup that seemed almost ceremonial in its richness. The broth was dark and flavorful, containing preserved vegetables and herbs that suggested careful attention to nutrition and sustenance through the difficult months ahead. Anselm ate slowly, allowing the warmth of the soup to spread through his aging frame. After the meal, he found himself in conversation with Brother Oswin and Brother Cuthbert in the warming room. The three men sat by the fire, and gradually a deeper conversation began to unfold. "How much longer do you think you will continue this work?" Oswin asked carefully, his tone suggesting both respect and a kind of gentleness around a topic that might be difficult. "The winters are becoming harder on your aging frame. I can see it." Anselm considered the question with his habitual thoughtfulness. "As long as the Abbey requires it," he said simply, "and as long as my body remains capable of performing the work. I have not considered stopping, and I do not expect to consider stopping until the moment when stopping becomes inevitable." "There is no shame in training a younger brother to take on this responsibility," Cuthbert observed. "Brother Thomas seems increasingly capable. He could learn your knowledge." "I am already teaching him," Anselm replied. "But knowledge cannot be transferred like grain from one container to another. It must be lived in gradually. Thomas will eventually be ready to assume the primary responsibility for the ponds, but that day is not yet. For now, he is learning through observation and participation. That is sufficient." The conversation moved to other topics: the state of the monastery's supplies, predictions about the severity of the coming winter, thoughts about the liturgical celebrations that would soon arrive with the winter season. Yet beneath these practical and spiritual matters, Anselm sensed a deeper layer of concern about his own aging and the question of succession. He did not dismiss these concerns as invalid. They were practical considerations that any monastery must address. But Anselm had long since learned that the future would unfold according to its own logic, and his role was simply to perform his work with full attention in the present moment. The future would take care of itself if the present was tended properly. That night in his cell, Anselm lay awake for longer than usual. The cold was intense, and sleep seemed reluctant to arrive. Instead, his mind moved through the long arc of his life, the decades he had spent at the Fishponds, the cycles of seasons that had repeated year after year, the gradual transformations that age had brought to his body, while his essential nature seemed to remain constant. He thought about death, as he sometimes did on particularly cold nights. Death was not frightening to him. It was simply the final transition, the last movement in the great cycle of transformations. Water became ice. Ice returned to water. Living things transformed into death. Death nourished new life. The cycle continued eternally, and his own role in that cycle seemed both infinitesimally small and somehow complete in its own way. Eventually, sleep arrived, and he passed into the profound rest that his laboring body required. The fifth morning brought a significant change. Snow had begun to fall during the night, and when Anselm emerged from the abbey, he found the entire landscape transformed into something almost unrecognizable beneath its white covering. The Fishponds were surrounded by a landscape of pure white, broken only by the dark waters of the ponds themselves and the stone structures that Anselm and others had built over the decades. The snowfall created a strange quality of silence and stillness. Sound seemed to be absorbed by the snow rather than reflected or echoed. The world appeared almost muffled, as though existence itself had been wrapped in some soft, protective covering. Anselm moved slowly through the snow toward the ponds, his footsteps creating clear impressions on the white surface. At the edge of the upper pond, he found the situation much as he had anticipated. The thin ice that had been forming along the margins had thickened noticeably overnight, and the snow had accumulated on top of it, creating a layer that would gradually compact and harden. He began the work of checking the water flow at the various outlets and inlets, ensuring that the constant spring feed was not being blocked by accumulating ice. This was work that would occupy him regularly now, the delicate balance of maintaining water flow while the entire landscape became increasingly frozen. Brother Thomas arrived, moving carefully through the snow. The young man was still learning how to navigate the increasingly difficult conditions, but his movements were gradually becoming more assured. He carried a wooden staff for balance, recognizing that the snow and ice would make footing uncertain. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, observing the transformed landscape with evident wonder. "It's like the entire world has been remade into something new." "It is the same world," Anselm replied gently, merely experiencing a different state of its being. "The ponds are still the ponds. The earth is still the earth. The essential nature of things does not change, only their surface manifestation transforms." They worked together through the morning, and by noon they had completed the basic inspections and begun the process of gradually concentrating the fish population. This was delicate work, moving fish without harming them, using nets and careful handling to transfer them from the upper and middle ponds toward the lower pond where they would spend the winter months. The work was less physically demanding than much of what Anselm performed during warmer seasons, but it required intense focus and careful attention. Each fish represented a future food source, a creature that the monastery depended upon. The responsibility of ensuring their safe passage and their survival through the winter was something Anselm carried with profound seriousness. By the time afternoon began its transition toward evening, they had successfully moved approximately half of the fish population to the lower pond. The remaining fish would be moved gradually over the coming weeks as the upper ponds became progressively more frozen. This staged approach ensured that the fish had time to acclimate to their new environment and that the capacity of the lower pond was not overwhelmed too suddenly. That evening, a meeting was called in the refectory after the meal. The abbot, a man named Robert who was perhaps 60 years old and had led the monastery for nearly a decade, addressed the assembled brothers about the winter ahead. "Brothers," the abbot began, his voice carrying the authority of his position, "the season of cold is upon us. The snows have begun, and the days grow increasingly short. We must husband our resources with care. Brother Cuthbert has been authorized to implement rationing if necessary, to ensure that our stores will sustain us through to spring. The workshops will operate on limited schedules to preserve light and heat. The library will close for the coldest part of the winter to conserve fuel for warming rooms elsewhere in the abbey." He paused, his gaze moving across the assembled monks. "And I wish to acknowledge the work that Brother Anselm performs at the Fishponds during these difficult months. The fish that he tenders with such care will provide crucial nutrition for us all through the winter. Let us give thanks for his dedication and for the divine providence that ensures we do not lack sustenance." The assembled brothers intoned a traditional response of gratitude, and Anselm felt a subtle warmth at being recognized in this way. Yet he felt no pride about the acknowledgement. He understood it simply as an expression of community gratitude for labor performed. He would perform the work whether it received recognition or not. The recognition did not change the essential nature of the work. After the meal, he found himself walking with the abbot through the abbey's corridors. The abbot spoke to him with the particular quality of deference that Anselm had earned through decades of service and reliable dedication. "How do you assess the winter, Brother Anselm?" the abbot asked. "Brother Oswin suggested that it may be particularly harsh." "The signs suggest significant cold and snow," Anselm replied carefully. "But the ponds are well prepared. The fish are healthy and numerous. The lower pond has excellent water flow from the spring source. I believe we will do well this winter, assuming the cold does not exceed what we have survived in previous years." "And you?" the abbot asked, his tone suggesting he was asking about more than simply Anselm's physical condition. "How are you managing the advancing years? The winters become harder on aging frames." "I am sustained by the work itself," Anselm replied, "and by the knowledge that the work is necessary and valued. As long as my body permits, I will continue." The abbot nodded slowly, seeming to accept this response. "I wish you to train Brother Thomas more formally," he said. "In the event that circumstances require a transition, the young man should be prepared to assume responsibility for the ponds. This is not because I expect that moment to arrive soon, but because wisdom requires us to plan for eventual transitions. Brother Thomas is beginning his apprenticeship in the ways of the ponds, Anselm agreed. I will ensure that he learns not merely the techniques, but the deeper understanding that underlies them. That night, the snow continued to fall. Anselm stood at the window of his cell and watched the white flakes descend steadily through the darkness, their patterns illuminated by the faint moonlight that filtered through the clouds. The snowfall seemed almost infinite, as though it might continue forever, gradually burying the entire world beneath an ever-deepening blanket of white. Yet he knew from long experience that the snowfall would eventually cease. The sun would continue to move through the sky, gradually becoming stronger despite the cold. Spring would eventually arrive, as it always did. The cycle would continue its inexorable progression, and the snow would return to water, and the water would nourish new growth, and life would renew itself. All of this had happened countless times before, and it would happen countless times again, long after Anselm himself had passed from existence. He was simply one moment in an infinite sequence of moments, one participant in a process that vastly transcended his individual life and importance. This understanding brought a profound peace. There was nothing to fear about the future, nothing to resist about the present, nothing to regret about the past. There was only the eternal now, the constant unfolding of existence, and the opportunity to participate in that unfolding with full attention and care. Sleep came deep and restful that night, and Anselm dreamed of water flowing in infinite patterns, of fish swimming through clear depths, of seasons turning eternally toward spring. The sixth morning arrived in profound silence. The snow had ceased falling sometime during the night, and the world beyond the abbey walls lay in absolute stillness beneath its white covering. The silence was so complete that it seemed almost tangible, as though sound itself had been temporarily suspended by the weight and purity of the snow. Anselm woke before dawn, as always, and made his way through the abbey's dark corridors toward the Fishponds. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his footsteps created the only sounds in the profound quiet. The monastery itself seemed to be sleeping deeply, conserving energy and warmth against the advancing cold. At the upper pond, he found that the ice had thickened considerably overnight. What had been a thin crystalline margin just days before had now become a solid band several feet wide around the pond's perimeter. The water in the center remained open, kept liquid by the constant flow from the spring source, but the transformation was accelerating. Winter was establishing its dominion over the landscape. Anselm performed his morning checks with meticulous care. He tested the ice at various points, ensuring it was solidifying evenly and that no unexpected weaknesses were developing. He verified that the water flow remained unobstructed. He moved along the banks, observing the condition of all the structures that he had so carefully maintained and reinforced throughout the preceding weeks. By the time the first gray light began to emerge on the eastern horizon, he had completed his primary morning work. The pond was secure, the water was flowing properly, the structures were sound. Everything was prepared as well as human skill and foresight could prepare it. Brother Thomas appeared as the gray light was strengthening toward actual dawn. The young man's movements were becoming increasingly confident in the snow, and his breathing had slowed into a rhythm that suggested he was beginning to understand the pace that such work required, a pace that could be sustained, that did not exhaust the worker, but rather entered into a kind of harmony with the body's natural rhythms. "The ice is beautiful," Thomas observed, looking out across the frozen surface. "But I confess I did not realize how fragile it must be. I had thought ice was simply solid, unchanging. But observing it form gradually, seeing how it begins at the edges and works its way inward, I understand now that it is in constant transition, even as it appears to be fixed." "All things are in constant transition," Anselm replied, his work-reddened hands gesturing across the frozen landscape. "This is one of the fundamental truths that the medieval philosophers attempted to articulate. We perceive things as fixed and stable, but in reality, everything is constantly transforming. Ice becomes water, water becomes ice. The appearance of fixity is merely a perspective that does not extend far enough to perceive the deeper transformation occurring." They worked together through the morning, completing the second phase of the fish transfer. More creatures were moved from the middle pond toward the lower pond, where they would spend the winter months. The work was performed with gentle efficiency, Anselm's decades of experience ensuring that no unnecessary trauma was inflicted on the creatures being transferred. At midday, when the bells called the brothers to prayer and meal, Anselm and Thomas made their way back toward the abbey. The snow crunched beneath their feet, a sound that seemed almost musical in its regularity and texture. Inside the warming room, they removed their outer layers and allowed the heat from the fire to gradually restore warmth to their cold, stiffened frames. Brother Cuthbert brought warm broth, a particularly rich and flavorful version that seemed to contain additional herbs and possibly some preserved mushrooms. Anselm drank it slowly, feeling its warmth spread through his body. The simple act of consuming warmth when one had been in a deep cold for hours seemed almost like a sacrament, an act of gratitude for sustenance and comfort. "The stores are holding well," Cuthbert observed as he served the broth. "If the winter is not significantly harsher than usual, we should have adequate provisions through to spring. The fish you are moving to the lower pond will be crucial if we experience any shortfall in other resources." "The fish will be available when needed," Anselm replied. "I have already begun adjusting their feeding to prepare them for the long period of reduced activity and food availability that winter will bring. By the time they are needed for the table, they will have achieved a certain fatness that will provide both flavor and sustenance." The afternoon brought continued snow. The flakes began to fall once more, softly and steadily, adding additional layers to the white covering that had already accumulated. Anselm found himself working more slowly, recognizing that the accumulating snow made all movement and labor more demanding. He conserved his energy, performing only the essential tasks that could not be deferred. Brother Oswin appeared in the late afternoon, moving carefully through the snow with the confidence of a man accustomed to heavy labor in difficult conditions. The two men worked together to construct additional barriers around the lower pond, structures designed to help manage the snow accumulation and to provide some protection for the concentrated fish population against the deepening cold. "Your training of young Thomas is bearing fruit," Oswin observed as they worked, positioning wooden barriers at strategic points. "The boy moves with more assurance than he did weeks ago. He is beginning to understand the rhythms." "Understanding develops through repeated experience," Anselm replied. "Thomas is learning not merely with his mind, but with his entire being. His body is learning the work. His eyes are learning to see the signs that indicate seasonal changes. His spirit is beginning to comprehend the deeper wisdom that underlies this labor." By the time evening arrived, the snow had accumulated to a considerable depth. Walking had become noticeably more difficult, and the work had progressed at a slower pace than in warmer seasons. Yet there was something meditative about this slower pace, something that seemed to align with the deepening stillness of the approaching winter. In the refectory that evening, the abbot announced that certain activities would be suspended or dramatically reduced as the winter deepened. The workshops would operate on limited schedules. The library would close. The scriptorium would continue its work, but with additional heating required, making that work more costly in terms of fuel. The brothers were instructed to remain in the warming rooms and their cells as much as possible to conserve heat and fuel. "Brother Anselm," the abbot said, addressing him directly before the assembled monks, "your work at the Fishponds will continue as necessary, regardless of these restrictions. The fish must be tended, and your labor is essential to our survival through the winter. But I would ask that you limit your time at the ponds to what is genuinely necessary. The cold is deepening, and I would not wish to see you suffer unnecessary exposure." Anselm bowed his head in acknowledgement of the abbot's concern and instruction. "I will continue to perform what is necessary," he replied simply, "and I will take appropriate care to ensure I do not expose myself to unnecessary danger." That night the cold intensified dramatically. The temperature seemed to plummet hour by hour, and by the time deep night arrived, the abbey itself seemed to be struggling against the encroaching cold. Anselm lay in his cell, wrapped in his wool blanket, and could hear the wind moving through the stone corridors, carrying with it sounds from the frozen landscape outside. He thought about the fish in the lower pond, gathered now in the deeper waters where the spring feed maintained their survival. He thought about the ice continuing to form across the surface of the upper and middle ponds. He thought about spring, still months away, but inevitable in its approach. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the cold and by the awareness of winter's deepening grip on the world. When morning arrived, Anselm rose stiffly, his joints protesting against the intense cold. He dressed carefully, layering wool upon wool, and made his way toward the fish ponds. The landscape was transformed once more. The accumulated snow had drifted in certain areas, creating formations that blocked familiar pathways. Yet Anselm navigated through it without hesitation, his body remembering the way even when his eyes could not clearly perceive the familiar landmarks. At the upper pond, he found the ice had thickened even more dramatically. What had been perhaps 4 inches of ice just days before had now grown to perhaps a foot or more in thickness. The snow on top had compressed into a dense layer that was beginning to solidify into packed snow, almost ice itself. Anselm moved carefully across the frozen surface, testing its stability, verifying that it was solidifying evenly and showing no signs of unexpected weakness. The ice responded to his weight with a series of small creaks and cracks, sounds that were actually reassuring, indicating that the ice was settling properly and not developing dangerous fractures. He checked the overflow channels and the water flow mechanisms. Everything was functioning as it should, albeit more slowly than in warmer seasons. The cold had slowed the water's movement, but it continued to flow. Life's insistence on persistence even in the face of winter's apparent conquest of the landscape. Brother Thomas did not appear that morning. Anselm worked alone, moving slowly through his tasks with the deliberate care that winter's conditions demanded. The cold was intense enough that staying in one location for extended periods became genuinely dangerous. He performed his work in segments, checking one structure, then moving to another, allowing his body periodic movement to maintain circulation. By midday, when the bells called for prayer and meal, Anselm made his way back toward the abbey. His fingers were numb despite the heavy gloves he wore, and his face had a quality of stiffness that suggested frostbite might be beginning to develop. He moved directly to the warming room, where he spent the afternoon gradually restoring sensation to his extremities. Brother Cuthbert brought warm broth and examined Anselm's hands and face with a concern that suggested the kitchener understood the very real dangers of the cold. "You must be more careful," Cuthbert said, his voice carrying both affection and worry. "The cold this year is the harshest I have experienced in many winters. It is dangerous to spend extended periods outdoors." "The fish must be tended," Anselm replied simply. "The work cannot be deferred because of the severity of the season, and my body remains capable of performing what is necessary." That night, unable to attend evening prayers due to lingering effects of the cold, his joints had become especially stiff, and movement was painful. Anselm remained in his cell. He sat by the small window and looked out toward the direction of the fish ponds, though he could see only darkness, and occasionally, by moonlight, the white landscape of snow. His mind moved through the day's observations. The ice was solidifying properly. The water was continuing to flow. The fish in the lower pond were surviving in their concentrated state. Everything that could be controlled by his labor was being attended to with the same meticulous care he had brought to this work for 37 years. He thought about what lay ahead. If the cold continued at this intensity, if the snow continued to accumulate at this rate, the winter would indeed be more difficult than most. Yet he had survived difficult winters before, and so had the fish ponds and their inhabitants. The cycles of difficulty and recovery were part of the natural order, not anomalies to be feared, but rather phenomena to be adapted to and endured. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, and in the morning Anselm woke to find that his body had recovered much of its mobility. He rose stiffly, but without the acute pain that had marked the previous evening. His hands and face bore no lasting damage from the cold exposure. He had been fortunate. The 7th day of this winter cycle brought clearer skies. The snow had ceased falling, and the clouds had begun to break apart, allowing occasional glimpses of blue sky and stronger sunlight. The increased light seemed to bring a subtle warming, though the temperature remained well below freezing. Anselm worked more comfortably that day, moving with greater fluidity now that his body had recovered from the intense cold exposure. He worked alone, as Thomas seemed to have been excused from pond duty due to the extreme conditions, a concession to the young man's age and relative lack of experience with severe winter conditions. In the late afternoon, Brother William, the scribe, appeared at the Fishponds. The older monk moved carefully through the snow, and Anselm recognized that this was not a routine visit. William had something specific he wished to communicate. "I have been copying a text," William said, settling himself onto a stone after Anselm had greeted him. "That contains reflections on labor and prayer from the Desert Fathers, those monks of ancient times who withdrew to the desert to pursue radical holiness. One of them wrote something that I thought of you, Brother Anselm." William recited from memory. The monk's labor is prayer made visible in the world. When we work with our hands in service to the community, we are expressing in physical form the devotion that prayer expresses in words. The two forms of prayer are not separate. They are manifestations of the same spiritual reality. Anselm listened intently, feeling the truth of this observation resonate deeply within his being. He had never articulated his understanding in these terms, yet the words perfectly captured the essence of how he understood his own labor at the Fishponds. "Thank you for bringing this to me," Anselm said simply. "You remind me that the insights of the ancient teachers continue to illuminate our understanding across the centuries." "And you remind me," William replied, "that the work we perform in the scriptorium, copying texts, preserving knowledge, is itself dependent on the labor of those like you who ensure the community's survival. Our work is interdependent. Neither of us could accomplish what we accomplished in isolation." They sat together in the fading light of late afternoon, two aging monks who had lived in close community for nearly 30 years, expressing through these brief observations the profound respect and understanding that had developed between them across the decades. When William had returned to the abbey, Anselm stood alone at the lower pond and looked down into the depths where the fish were gathered. The water was clear enough that he could see their shadows moving in the deep, sustained by the constant flow from the spring source, waiting in patient darkness for the seasons to turn and bring them either back to the upper ponds or, for some, to the monastery's table. The evening arrived with deep cold but clear skies. The stars emerged brilliantly, more visible than they had been for many nights due to the clarity of the atmosphere. Anselm stood at the edge of the lower pond and looked upward, observing the ancient patterns of stars that had guided travelers and marked seasons for thousands of years before his birth, and would continue to do so for thousands of years after his death. All of it, the stars, the seasons, the water, the fish, the work of his hands, the beating of his heart, all of it was part of a vast, incomprehensibly complex harmony. His individual role was small, yet complete. His labor was essential, yet part of something infinitely larger than himself. This understanding brought neither pride nor humility, but simply a deep acceptance of his place within the whole. The eighth morning brought a quality of profound silence and stillness that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. Anselm woke in absolute darkness and lay for a moment simply listening to the quiet. No wind moved through the corridors. No sounds of monastic life disturbed the peace. The entire abbey seemed to be suspended in a state of deep hibernation, as though winter had pressed a pause button on all ordinary activity. He rose slowly, his aged frame moving with deliberate care against the intense cold that had accumulated in his cell overnight. His breath formed thick clouds, and his fingers seemed stiff even before he attempted to dress. Yet he moved through these preparations with the unhurried certainty of one who had performed this same ritual thousands of times before. The abbey's corridors were particularly cold this morning. Anselm could feel the difference in how the stone itself seemed to radiate cold, rather than merely fail to provide warmth. The heating from the warming rooms could not penetrate deeply enough to reach these outer passages, and the temperature seemed to have dropped to a level that approached genuine danger. Yet he proceeded toward the Fishponds as he always did. His body adapted over decades to endure what would have been unthinkable cold for someone unaccustomed to such exposure. At the upper pond, he found a situation that caused him to pause and observe carefully. The ice had become so thick that it now completely covered the entire surface, and the snow on top had compressed into a hard, nearly impenetrable layer. Most significantly, the overflow channel, the mechanism through which excess water was normally directed back toward the source stream, appeared to be blocked or severely restricted. This was precisely the kind of situation that Anselm had anticipated during the weeks of preparation. The ice had accumulated in such a way that it was interfering with the careful water management system that he had designed and maintained over decades. If the overflow became completely blocked, water pressure would begin to accumulate. If that pressure became too great, it could rupture the careful structures that controlled water flow between the ponds. Anselm knelt at the overflow channel, his aged joints protesting against the motion, and examined the blockage carefully. His work-reddened hands, even numb with cold, could feel the ice and the way it had accumulated around the channel opening. The blockage was not complete. Water was still flowing, but only barely, suggesting that the system was operating at critical capacity. He needed tools, specifically, implements that would allow him to carefully chip away at the ice without damaging the underlying structure. He made his way back toward the abbey, moving with a sense of purpose that overrode the discomfort of the cold. This was work that could not wait. If the overflow became completely blocked, the consequences could be severe. He found Brother Oswin in the workshops, already at work despite the early hour and the bitter cold. The craftsman listened to Anselm's explanation of the situation, and his weathered face grew thoughtful. "This cold is beyond what we normally experience," Oswin said, selecting several implements from his collection: small chisels, a wooden mallet, specialized tools designed specifically for working with ice and frozen water. "You need to be extremely careful. If you crack the stone or the underlying structures while chipping away ice, you could cause far worse problems than a blocked overflow." "I understand the risks," Anselm replied, "but the blockage cannot be allowed to worsen. I must address it before it becomes critical." They made their way together back to the upper pond, and for the next several hours, Anselm worked with meticulous care to clear the overflow channel. The work required extraordinary attention. Each strike of the mallet had to be calibrated precisely to remove ice without damaging the stone or the careful engineering that underlaid it. Oswin stood nearby, ready to assist or advise, but the primary work was Anselm's responsibility. His decades of intimate knowledge of these structures made him the only person truly qualified to understand the precise balance between clearing the blockage and maintaining the integrity of the system. By the time the midday bells began to ring, the overflow channel had been sufficiently cleared that water was flowing through it once more at a sustainable rate. Anselm sat back on his heels, his breath coming heavily despite the cold, his aging body expressing its exhaustion through the trembling of his limbs. "You should rest," Oswin said, his voice carrying concern. "That was delicate work, and you pushed your body to its limits in this cold." "I will rest," Anselm agreed. "But first, I must verify that the flow is stable and will not freeze immediately." They spent another hour observing the water moving through the cleared channel, watching to ensure that the flow rate was adequate and that ice was not immediately beginning to reaccumulate in dangerous patterns. Only when Anselm was satisfied that the immediate crisis had been addressed did he allow himself to make his way back toward the abbey. In the warming room, Brother Cuthbert examined Anselm's hands and face with evident concern. "You have pushed yourself too far," the Kitchener said firmly. "Your extremities show signs of serious cold exposure. You must rest today, and you must limit your outdoor work tomorrow as well." "The ponds required attention," Anselm replied simply. "The work could not be deferred." "And what good is it if you collapse from cold exposure and cannot perform any work at all?" Cuthbert demanded, his voice sharp with worry. "You are not young, Brother Anselm. Your body has limits, and you must respect those limits." Anselm accepted the rebuke without argument. He sat by the fire and allowed Cuthbert to bring warm broth and carefully apply warming remedies to his hands and face. The sensation of returning feeling in his fingers was both relief and pain. The pain that came as circulation returned to tissue that had begun to experience frostbite. That afternoon, while Anselm rested in the warming room, Brother Thomas arrived with news that worried Anselm more than he was willing to express. The young man reported that Brother William had not appeared for morning prayers, and when others had checked his cell, they had found the elderly scribe in a state of apparent confusion, speaking incoherently and showing signs of serious illness. "The abbot has summoned Brother Marcus, who tends to the sick," Thomas reported. "Brother William's cell is very cold. Some of us have been moving additional blankets and attempting to warm the space, but Brother Marcus fears the cold may have affected his mind severely." Anselm's heart grew heavy at this news. He had known William for nearly 3 decades. The scribe had been a fixture of the abbey's intellectual and spiritual life for even longer than Anselm had been maintaining the Fishponds. The thought that William might be seriously compromised by illness was deeply disturbing. After the afternoon meal, When his body had recovered somewhat from the morning's strenuous work, Anselm made his way to the infirmary where Brother Marcus had established a care space for William. The scribe lay on a narrow bed, wrapped in multiple blankets, and his face bore the pallor of serious illness. His eyes were open but seemed unfocused, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "He has developed a fever," Brother Marcus explained quietly. "I believe the cold has compromised his body's defenses. He was already taxed from his work in the scriptorium. The copying requires intense focus, and the room has been increasingly cold despite our efforts to maintain warmth. I fear he may have caught an illness that others have been experiencing in the Abbey." Anselm sat beside William's bed and observed his old friend with deep concern. The man who had spent decades copying manuscripts, whose hands had been permanently stained with ink, whose mind had been sharp and observant, now lay diminished by fever and confusion. "Will he recover?" Anselm asked quietly. "It is in God's hands," Brother Marcus replied, which was the honest answer that the healer could give when faced with genuine uncertainty. "I will do what I can to ease his fever and maintain his strength. But at his age, and in the severity of this winter, recovery is far from certain." Anselm spent the remainder of the afternoon sitting beside William's bed, occasionally speaking quietly to his old friend, though he could not be certain that William heard or understood his words. He recited passages from the Psalms, offering the familiar rhythm of liturgical language as a form of comfort for them both. By evening, when the bells called for prayer, Anselm had to leave the infirmary and make his way to the chapel. The community gathered to offer prayers for William's recovery, and the abbot made an announcement that all brothers were to reduce their outdoor labor and conserve their strength to maintain resistance to illness. "This winter has tested us beyond the norm," the abbot said, his voice carrying both compassion and a certain gravity. "We are losing stores of fuel more rapidly than anticipated due to the extreme cold. We are losing brothers to illness that the cold and the stress have made more severe. We must all work together to ensure the community's survival through spring." That night, Anselm lay in his cell and listened to the wind howling through the Abbey's stone passages. The sound was almost like the wailing of some vast creature, expressing the suffering and struggle that the winter was imposing on all living things. He thought about William, about the decades they had lived in close community without extensive conversation, yet with a deep mutual understanding and respect. He thought about the manuscripts that William had copied, texts that would survive even after William himself had passed into history. He thought about the paradox of human existence, how individual lives were finite and fragile, yet the work that individuals performed could endure far beyond their own existence. Sleep came fitfully, and in the morning, Anselm woke with a sense of profound weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical fatigue. The weight of winter, the weight of age, the weight of mortality itself seemed to press down upon him with unusual intensity. Yet there was still work to be done. The Fishponds did not cease to require attention simply because the world had grown harder and colder. Anselm rose, dressed, and made his way once more toward his labors. The 9th day brought another complication. A section of the reinforced bank at the upper pond, The area that Anselm and Oswin had worked to strengthen weeks before against erosion had developed a crack. The intense cold had apparently caused the earth to contract in a way that stressed the structure, and the resulting crack suggested that the reinforcement might be failing. Anselm examined the crack with meticulous care, tracing its path, feeling how wide it had become, understanding the implications of what he was observing. The crack was not immediately catastrophic, but it represented a fundamental shift in the stability of the bank. If it continued to widen, it could eventually lead to structural failure. He needed to address this as well, but in this extreme cold, such work was extraordinarily challenging. Frozen earth did not respond to normal manipulation. The very materials he would normally use for reinforcement were brittle and difficult to work with when frozen. Anselm stood at the cracked bank and allowed himself a moment of weariness. The work was never-ending. Winter had become a succession of problems, each requiring solution, each demanding his full attention and exhausted effort. Yet this was the nature of stewardship: to continue to attend, to continue to work, to continue to care even when fatigue seemed overwhelming. Brother Thomas appeared, moving carefully through the snow with increasing competence. The young man's face reflected concern when he observed the crack in the bank. "Is this serious?" Thomas asked. "It is manageable if addressed carefully," Anselm replied. "But it will require work that is best deferred until weather conditions improve. For now, I will monitor it closely and ensure it does not develop further complications." They worked together through the morning, performing the routine maintenance tasks that could be accomplished despite the cold and the structural challenges. By midday, when the bells called for prayer and meal, they made their way back toward the abbey. In the infirmary, Anselm learned that Brother William's condition had worsened. The fever had intensified, and William had begun to experience periods of delirium during which he seemed to believe he was in different times and places. Brother Marcus was doing everything within his capacity to ease the scribe's suffering, but recovery seemed increasingly unlikely. Anselm sat with William that afternoon, watching over his old friend as the man drifted in and out of consciousness. Once, William seemed to focus momentarily on Anselm's face, and his hand, thin and fever-hot, reached out and grasped Anselm's work-reddened fingers. "The words," William whispered, his voice barely audible. "The words must continue. After I am gone, the words must continue." "They will," Anselm assured him gently. "Others will copy what you have begun. The work continues through many hands." William's grip weakened, and he drifted away into unconsciousness once more. Anselm sat holding his friend's hand, feeling the fever burning in William's body, aware that he was witnessing the approach of death, not in any dramatic or sudden way, but through the simple physical failure that came when an aging body, already stressed by years of intense labor, was overwhelmed by illness in winter's harsh conditions. That night, the bells did not ring for William's recovery at evening prayer. Instead, the abbot announced that Brother William had passed into eternal rest, his earthly labors completed. The community would gather the following morning to prepare his body and to offer funeral masses for his soul. Anselm felt the weight of this news settle over him like the snow that continued to accumulate outside the abbey's walls. William was gone. The scriptorium would be quieter now. The manuscripts would still be copied. There were other scribes, younger men still capable of performing this work. But William's particular presence, his decades of expertise and careful attention, his ability to illuminate not merely parchment but the souls of those around him through his gentle wisdom, all of this was now part of the past. That night, Anselm did not sleep. He sat in his cell and kept vigil, praying for William's soul, reflecting on the decades of companionship and the strange intimacy that had developed between two men who had lived in close community, yet communicated primarily through the language of labor performed with full attention and care. In the morning, the community gathered to prepare William's body and to offer the funeral masses. Anselm participated in the rituals, his voice joining with the other brothers in the ancient Latin chants that had been used for centuries to commend souls to God's mercy. The words were familiar, but their weight seemed particularly profound this morning, as Anselm found himself contemplating not merely William's death, but the larger reality of mortality and the eventual dissolution of all individual lives. Yet even as this contemplation weighed upon him, Anselm recognized that the work remained. Winter continued its grip on the landscape. The fish ponds continued to require attention. The community continued to depend on his labor for its survival and sustenance through the cold months ahead. After the funeral mass, as the community dispersed to their various laborers, Anselm found himself standing alone in the scriptorium, looking at the desk where William had spent so many hours copying manuscripts. The space was empty now, waiting for another scribe to claim it, or perhaps to remain vacant as a memorial to the labor that had occurred there. Anselm ran his work-reddened hand across the desk's smooth surface, feeling the subtle indentations and wear marks that William's decades of labor had created. Then he turned and made his way back toward the fish ponds, understanding in his bones that the work would go on, that individuals would pass away, but the great cycles of labor and seasons and growth and death would continue their eternal progression. The 10th day of this winter cycle found Anselm working with particular focus on the lower pond, where the concentrated fish population was continuing to survive in the deep water fed by the spring source. The ice on this pond was less thick than on the upper pond. The constant water flow and the slightly deeper temperature of the spring water maintained a greater degree of fluidity. But ice had still formed around the edges, and snow had accumulated on what remained of the frozen surface. Anselm worked alone, as he had been doing increasingly frequently. Brother Thomas had been given additional duties elsewhere in the abbey as the winter's challenges multiplied. Other brothers were occupied with their own necessary labors. Anselm found that he preferred working alone now, finding in solitude a quality of peace that the company of others, however companionable, could not provide. The work was becoming harder, and Anselm was becoming increasingly aware of his own physical limitations. His aged body was struggling against the cold in ways that it had not struggled in previous winters. His joints ached perpetually, and his movements had become noticeably slower and more labored. Yet the work continued. It had to continue. This was the essential reality that Anselm had come to understand over decades of labor. The work did not adjust itself to his capacity. Rather, his capacity had to adjust itself to the demands of the work. And when his capacity finally became insufficient, then the work would pass to other hands, and Anselm's role would be complete. As he sat by the lower pond in the pale afternoon light, watching the shadows of fish moving in the deep water, Anselm felt a particular clarity about this truth. He was not indispensable. His individual effort, while necessary in this moment, would eventually be replaced by other efforts performed by other people with other skills and understandings. The work itself was eternal, but individuals who performed the work were temporary. This understanding brought not sadness, but a kind of peace. His responsibility was simply to perform the work well for as long as he was capable of performing it, and then to release it gracefully to others. Everything else was beyond his control and his concern. The 11th day arrived with a subtle shift in the quality of light. The sun, though still low on the horizon and providing minimal warmth, seemed to have gained a degree of strength that suggested, faintly, that the turning of the seasons was beginning, slowly, imperceptibly, but genuinely. Winter was not loosening its grip, yet the angle of light suggested that, somewhere deep in the cosmic mechanics of the world, spring was already beginning its approach. Anselm woke before dawn, as always, and lay for a moment observing the quality of darkness that surrounded him. It seemed slightly less profound than it had been in previous weeks, not lighter exactly, but containing a different quality, as though the darkness itself was beginning to anticipate eventual illumination. He rose and dressed with the same deliberate care he had brought to this ritual for decades. His joints protested more than they had in previous years, and the cold seemed to penetrate more deeply into his aging frame. Yet he moved through the preparations with the unhurried certainty of absolute habit. At the Fishponds, he found that his daily assessment revealed a subtle but genuine improvement in conditions. The ice had stopped thickening at the rate it had been advancing. The water flow, while still constrained by frozen channels, had stabilized at a sustainable level. The fish in the lower pond were surviving in their concentrated state, and though their activity had diminished, as was natural in the cold, they showed no signs of distress or unusual mortality. Anselm performed his morning checks with meticulous attention, understanding that this moment of stabilization would not last. Weeks of winter remained ahead, and new challenges would undoubtedly emerge before spring arrived. Yet for this morning, the pond seemed to have achieved a kind of equilibrium with the season, no longer struggling, but simply existing in a state of diminished but sustainable activity. Brother Thomas appeared as the first gray light was strengthening toward actual dawn. The young man had returned to his regular duties at the ponds, having been released from the additional tasks that had occupied him in recent days. His movements were now noticeably confident. The fear and uncertainty that had characterized his early weeks in the monastery had been replaced by a quiet competence born of repeated experience. "The cold seems less intense this morning," Thomas observed, his breath forming clouds in the still air. "Or perhaps I am simply becoming accustomed to it." "Both are true," Anselm replied. The cold has indeed eased slightly. The season is beginning its turning, though it will advance so gradually that we may not notice the change from day to day. Yet it is also true that you are becoming accustomed to the cold. Your body is adapting, learning to function in conditions that would have been unbearable to you weeks ago. This adaptation is one of the great capacities of human existence. We are creatures capable of adjusting to circumstances that initially seem impossibly harsh. They worked together through the morning, and by the time the midday bells rang, they had completed a thorough inspection of all 3 ponds and verified that the winter management systems were functioning as well as could be expected given the extreme cold. In the refectory, Anselm noticed that the community seemed to be breathing more easily, as though a certain weight had been lifted. The abbot had announced that the worst of the winter's extreme cold appeared to have passed, though he cautioned that weeks of difficult weather remained ahead. "We have lost 3 brothers to illness brought on by the cold and the stress of the season," the abbot said, his voice carrying both sorrow and a certain acceptance of the losses that winter inevitably brought. "We have lost stores of fuel more rapidly than anticipated, yet we are surviving. The community holds. Our supplies, while reduced, remain adequate for survival until spring. We will endure, and we will emerge from this winter with gratitude for God's preservation of us through the trial." After the meal, Anselm made his way to the infirmary to visit with Brother Marcus. The healer was occupied with tidying the space, now that most of the severe illness had passed. "You are aging more rapidly this winter," Brother Marcus observed without preamble, his direct manner suggesting long acquaintance and honest concern. "Your face shows the marks of strain, and your movements have become noticeably slower and more labored. How do you feel?" "I feel the weight of years," Anselm replied honestly. "This winter has been harder than most, and my body is responding to the difficulty more acutely than it has in previous seasons. Yet I remain capable of performing my work, and that is what matters." "Your work will continue," Brother Marcus said, "but not indefinitely. You must understand this, Brother Anselm. At some point, your body will simply refuse to continue. You should be preparing for that eventuality, ensuring that your knowledge is being properly transferred to someone capable of assuming your responsibilities." "Brother Thomas is learning," Anselm replied. "But true learning requires time and experience. He cannot be rushed to readiness simply because my own aging might eventually necessitate a transition." "Then perhaps you should consider training him more formally," Brother Marcus suggested. "The abbot has mentioned to me his concern that if something happened to you suddenly, an accident, a severe illness, the Fishponds might not be properly maintained during the crucial period when you could not perform the work." Anselm acknowledged the validity of this concern, though he did not commit to any specific change in his approach. He understood, on a level deeper than mere intellect, that his role was beginning to shift. He was no longer simply the keeper of the fish ponds, but also, increasingly, the keeper of knowledge about maintaining the fish ponds. Yet he also understood that true knowledge could not be transmitted through formal instruction alone. It had to be lived through years of repeated experience. That afternoon, Anselm sought out Brother Thomas and suggested that they spend the day working through the various seasonal tasks together, with Anselm providing explicit instruction about not merely how to perform each task, but why each task was necessary and how it related to the larger systems that maintained the ponds. They spent hours in the cold, moving from one task to another, with Anselm verbalizing his understanding of water flow and ice formation, and fish behavior and seasonal transitions, knowledge that he had previously communicated primarily through example and demonstration, but which he now recognized needed to be made explicit and verbal. The water must flow at a consistent rate, Anselm explained as they examined one of the channels. Too much flow, and the water cools excessively from the exposure to cold air. Too little flow, and ice accumulates too rapidly. The balance is achieved through careful calibration of the gate mechanisms, and the calibration must be adjusted as the season progresses and conditions change. Thomas listened intently, asking occasional questions that suggested he was beginning to understand not merely the mechanics of the work, but the reasoning that underlay the mechanics. "It is almost like music," Thomas observed at one point. "The different elements must work in harmony with each other. The flow of water, the accumulation of ice, the behavior of the fish, the turning of the seasons. They are all parts of a single composition, and my role is to maintain the harmony between them." Anselm smiled at this observation. "Exactly," he said. "You are beginning to understand the essential nature of this work. It is not merely the performance of tasks, but the maintenance of a kind of balance, a harmony that must be continuously adjusted as conditions change. When you can perceive the work in this way, you will have achieved the deepest level of understanding." That evening, as the light was fading and the cold was intensifying for the night, Anselm and Thomas stood together at the edge of the lower pond and watched the water in its profound stillness. The sky above was clearing, and the first stars were becoming visible, their light having traveled for years across the infinite distances of space to reach this frozen landscape on this particular evening. "When you become the keeper of these ponds," Anselm said quietly, "you must understand that you are not truly the keeper. You are simply a temporary steward of something that transcends your individual life and importance. The ponds will continue long after you are gone. The water will continue to flow. The seasons will continue to turn. Your role is simply to maintain the ponds well enough that this continuation is possible, and then to pass your responsibility to the next steward, and to trust that they will perform their work with the same care and attention that you have brought to it." "That is a humbling understanding," Thomas replied softly. "Yes," Anselm agreed, "but it is also a liberating one. When you understand that your individual importance is secondary to the importance of the work itself, you are released from the burden of personal significance. You can simply perform the work fully and completely, without the anxiety that comes from believing that everything depends on your individual excellence." They stood together in companionable silence as the darkness deepened, and the stars became increasingly visible. The conversation had woven together threads of teaching and learning that would continue to develop over months and years to come. The 12th day brought the first genuinely noticeable warming since the intense cold had begun weeks before. The temperature rose enough that, at midday, the sun's rays began to produce an almost imperceptible melting on the south-facing surfaces where ice and snow had accumulated. The melting was minimal, quickly refrozen when evening arrived, yet its occurrence was symbolically significant. Winter was beginning to demonstrate that it would not maintain its absolute grip forever. Anselm noticed that his body responded to this subtle warming with a kind of relief. The extreme cold had been exhausting in ways that he had not fully acknowledged, and the slight warming allowed his aging frame to relax slightly from the constant tension of resistance against the freezing temperatures. Brother Thomas commented on the change as well. "It feels almost as though the world is exhaling," the young man said, "as though everything that had been holding its breath against the cold is beginning to breathe more normally." "This is the beginning of the transition," Anselm confirmed. "We remain deep in winter. Many weeks of cold and difficult weather remain ahead. But from this point forward, the overall trend will be toward warming. The turning has begun." That afternoon, Anselm found himself in the scriptorium once more, standing at the empty desk where Brother William had spent so many hours copying manuscripts. A younger scribe named Gregory had been assigned to continue William's work, and he was already beginning to occupy the space, bringing with him his own implements and materials. "I have heard much about Brother William's skill," Gregory said respectfully when Anselm appeared. "I hope to prove myself capable of continuing the work he began." "The manuscripts do not demand perfection," Anselm replied. "They demand consistency and care. If you bring those qualities to your work, you will honor what Brother William began." "I have also heard," Gregory continued, "that you have been working at the Fishponds for nearly 40 years. That must require extraordinary dedication." "It requires only the commitment to show up each day and perform the work to the best of my ability," Anselm replied. "The years accumulate, but the work remains essentially the same day after day. Dedication develops through repetition, not through any special heroic quality." That night in his cell, Anselm felt a particular sense of peace. The community was surviving. The Fishponds had endured the harshest portion of winter. William's work was being continued by others. Thomas was learning the knowledge and skills necessary to eventually assume responsibility for the ponds. The great cycles of labor and seasons were continuing their eternal progression. He thought about death, his own death, which he could sense approaching with the same inevitability that spring was approaching, even now in the depth of winter. He did not fear it. He understood that death was simply the final transition, the last movement in a dance that had been composed for him before his birth and would continue after his death through others who would come after him. Sleep came peacefully, dreamlessly, and in the morning he woke to another day of work, another day of tending the fish ponds, another day of performing the labor that was both utterly humble and deeply sacred. The days continued their progression through the second half of winter. The cold remained, but it was no longer the extreme, almost supernatural cold of the previous weeks. Snow continued to fall occasionally, accumulating and then partially melting, and then accumulating again in the natural cycles of winter's later season. Anselm and Thomas work together regularly now, with Anselm increasingly providing instruction and explanation alongside the performance of tasks. The young man was absorbing knowledge at an accelerating rate, his understanding deepening as his experience accumulated. Other brothers occasionally appeared at the ponds to assist or to observe, drawn by the clarity of purpose and the fundamental importance of the work. The fish ponds had become, in a sense, a kind of teaching center for the entire community, a place where the essential nature of monastic labor could be most clearly perceived. In the community's life, winter gradually gave way to what might be called midwinter, a season that was neither the extreme cold of early winter nor the approaching warming of late winter, but a kind of plateau of cold, difficult, yet sustainable conditions. The brothers had settled into a rhythm of careful conservation of fuel and resources, of focused labor on the essential tasks that kept the community functioning, of prayer and contemplation during the long, dark evenings. Anselm found himself gradually becoming recognized, informally, as a kind of elder of the community. Younger brothers would occasionally seek his counsel about difficult situations, not necessarily expecting answers, but valuing the quality of thoughtful attention that he brought to any question. His decades of labor at the fish ponds had taught him to observe carefully and to understand that most problems, when examined patiently, contained their own inherent solutions. On one particularly cold evening, the abbot sought him out in the warming room and asked if he would be willing to take on a more formal role of teaching young brothers about the nature of monastic labor. Anselm accepted this responsibility with his characteristic quiet acceptance, understanding that this represented a natural evolution of his role within the community. "You have much wisdom to share," the abbot said, "not merely about the technical aspects of maintaining the fish ponds, but about the deeper meaning of labor performed with full attention and care. The community benefits from your presence, and we would benefit even more if that presence were explicitly oriented toward teaching and mentoring." "I will do what is asked," Anselm replied simply, "though I should note that teaching has always been part of my work. I have simply not always recognized it as such." The weeks continued their progression, and the turning of the season became increasingly evident despite the cold and occasional harsh weather. The sun's daily arc across the sky gradually shifted, rising higher and spending more time above the horizon. The light, though still pale and cold in quality, began to carry a subtle promise of eventual warmth. At the fish ponds, Anselm noticed the first signs that the fish were becoming more active in anticipation of the eventual warming and the return to the upper ponds. Their movements in the deep water became noticeably more vigorous, and their response to feeding became more enthusiastic, as though some ancient wisdom encoded in their bodies was already sensing the approaching season of greater activity. One afternoon in late winter, as the weakening light was beginning to shift from its noontime position, Anselm found himself standing alone at the edge of the lower pond, observing the shadows of fish moving in the deep water. Brother Thomas appeared, now moving with such confidence and competence that it was sometimes easy to forget how recently he had been a struggling newcomer to monastic life. I have been thinking, Thomas said, settling himself onto a stone beside Anselm, about what you said months ago about repetition and peace. I understand now what you meant. The work repeats itself endlessly, checking water flow, feeding fish, observing seasonal changes. And yet this repetition is not monotonous. It is deeply satisfying because the repetition is always occurring within a context of transformation. The seasons change, the fish grow and mature. I myself am learning and growing. Everything is changing, yet the essential nature of the work remains constant. I find I no longer resist this paradox. Instead, it brings me a sense of profound contentment. You are beginning to understand the true nature of monastic life, Anselm replied with quiet satisfaction. This understanding develops over years, and it requires both intellectual comprehension and lived experience. You are moving from one to the other. Will you eventually pass the primary responsibility for the ponds to me? Thomas asked. Yes, Anselm replied simply, but not yet. We will continue to work together through spring and summer and autumn, and perhaps through another winter. By that time, you will have experienced the full cycle of seasonal changes, and your understanding will be sufficiently deep that you can maintain the ponds independently. I will gradually become less essential, and you will gradually become more essential, until one day the transition will occur naturally and inevitably. Will you leave the monastery? Thomas asked, his voice suggesting the vulnerability of someone who had come to depend on another's presence. No, Anselm replied. I will remain here, but my primary labor will be finished. I will become what the monastery calls a contemplative elder, one who has spent decades in active labor and who now spends their final years in prayer and observation and occasional teaching. I will still be present, but my work will be different. They sat together in the fading light, watching the water and the shadows of the fish moving beneath its surface. The turning of winter toward spring, the turning of Thomas's labor toward leadership, the turning of Anselm's life toward its conclusion. All of these transformations were occurring simultaneously, within the great encompassing cycle of seasons and ages and the succession of generations. The light continued its gradual diminishment toward evening, and the temperature began to drop toward the cold of night. Yet there was something in the quality of this particular moment, the presence of two people sitting in companionable silence by the fish ponds, watching water and the evidence of life continuing beneath its surface. That seemed to contain something sacred and complete. The 13th day of this winter cycle arrived with unmistakable evidence that the season's turning was accelerating. The sun had begun to rise noticeably earlier and to set noticeably later. Though the cold remained significant, it no longer possessed the absolute, unrelenting quality that had characterized the heart of winter. The landscape itself seemed to be holding its breath, preparing for the dramatic transformation that spring would eventually bring. Anselm woke before dawn, as he had done for nearly 4 decades, and lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the abbey stirring to morning life. There were more sounds now than there had been in the depth of winter, the movements of brothers engaged in their various labors, the sounds of the monastery beginning its daily cycle. Winter's profound silence had given way to the more active soundscape of the advancing season. He rose and dressed with movements that had become almost ritualistic in their familiarity. His joints moved with the stiffness of age, yet the pain that had characterized the most extreme cold had begun to diminish. His body, though clearly in its decline, seemed to be experiencing some small relief from the harsh conditions it had endured. At the Fishponds, Anselm found a situation that required careful attention. The gradual warming had created conditions where the ice was beginning to weaken along the edges of the upper and middle ponds. This weakening was not yet dangerous. The ice remained thick enough to safely bear weight in most locations, but it represented the beginning of a new phase of seasonal management. The ponds were beginning their transition from winter stasis toward spring awakening. Anselm moved carefully across the ice of the upper pond, testing its integrity with each step, observing where it was becoming soft and where it remained solid. This assessment would inform the decisions he would need to make in the coming weeks about when to begin the process of moving fish back from the lower pond toward their normal seasonal distribution. Brother Thomas arrived, and together they began the work of inspecting the channels and gates that would soon need to be reopened to their full capacity. For weeks, these mechanisms had been operating at reduced levels, adjusted to the reality of the frozen landscape. Now they would need to be gradually reopened as the ponds began to resume their more normal patterns of water flow and exchange. The transition from winter to spring is as delicate as the transition from autumn to winter, Anselm instructed as they worked. We cannot simply return all the mechanisms to their summer configurations. The adjustment must be gradual, allowing the system to shift its equilibrium slowly rather than in sudden disruption. "Why is this necessary?" Thomas asked. "Would it not be more efficient to simply make the necessary changes all at once?" "Efficiency and wisdom are not always aligned," Anselm replied. "The ponds are not merely mechanical systems. They are living systems, and living things adjust to change more successfully when that change occurs gradually. The fish must acclimate to warmer water and more varied locations. The balance of aquatic life within the ponds must shift slowly. The entire ecosystem must transition in a coordinated manner. Patience and gradual adjustment serve the ponds far better than rapid reorganization would." The morning advanced, and their work continued with the same methodical care that had characterized all their efforts through the winter. By the time the midday bells rang, they had completed the inspection of the primary channels and had begun making the first-minute adjustments to the gate mechanisms, adjustments so subtle that they were barely perceptible, yet which began the process of increasing water flow between the ponds. In the refectory, the community gathered for the midday meal, and Anselm observed that the food was noticeably different from what had been served through the heart of winter. Fresh vegetables had begun to appear, roots preserved from autumn's harvest, greens that had been stored in particular ways to maintain their nutritional value. The stores were still limited, and portions remained carefully controlled, but the rigorous rationing of the deepest winter had begun to ease slightly. The abbot made an announcement that Brother Gregory, the young scribe who had assumed William's position, would need to receive assistance from other brothers. The work of copying manuscripts required so much fuel for heating the scriptorium that the abbot had decided to reduce the scriptorium's operating schedule during the days when the warming room could provide adequate heat for study and contemplation. "We honor the work of preserving knowledge," the abbot said, "but we must also acknowledge the very real cost of that work in terms of fuel and resources. By coordinating the scriptorium's schedule with the availability of heat in other warming spaces, we can reduce the monastery's overall consumption while still maintaining the essential work of copying and preserving texts." Anselm noticed that Brother Gregory appeared somewhat troubled by this announcement, concerned perhaps that the reduction in schedule represented a diminishment of the importance of his work. After the meal, Anselm sought him out and found the young scribe in the scriptorium, standing at his desk and observing the cold space around him. "The adjustment of schedule is not a diminishment of the work's importance," Anselm said gently. "It is simply an acknowledgement of the reality of our circumstances. Wise stewardship requires that we balance all of our responsibilities against our limited resources. The work of copying manuscripts remains essential. It is simply being performed within the context of overall community needs." Brother William seemed to accept such limitations without concern, Gregory replied. "Yet I find myself struggling against them. I wish to spend all my time at this work, to advance the copying as quickly as possible. The idea of reduced hours feels like a frustration of my vocation." Brother William had spent decades learning to balance his own desires against the community's needs, Anselm replied. "This balance develops over time. Your struggle is not a failure. It is simply the process through which you will develop the wisdom that William had achieved." That afternoon, Anselm found himself reflecting on the various forms of labor that the monastery required. The work at the Fishponds was his own, but it was only one manifestation of the broader principle of stewardship that animated all monastic labor. Gregory's work at copying manuscripts, Thomas's growing capacity to manage the ponds, Oswin's work maintaining structures, Cuthbert's work managing the kitchens and stores. All of it was essential, all of it was sacred, all of it served the larger purpose of maintaining the community and preserving knowledge and spiritual practice through the cycles of seasons and years. The work was never singular. It was always plural, always a vast web of interdependent labors, each one necessary, each one contributing to the whole in ways that were often not immediately visible to the individual laborer. As evening approached, Anselm made his way to a part of the abbey he had not visited in many weeks, the library. This space had been closed for much of the winter to preserve heat and fuel, but as the season had turned, it had been gradually reopened. Brother Aelred, the elderly monk who served as librarian, was organizing the space and preparing manuscripts for the warmer season, when more brothers would have opportunity to read and study. "Brother Anselm," Aelred greeted him warmly, "it has been too long since we have seen you. How do the Fishponds fare as winter transitions toward spring?" "The ponds are beginning their transition," Anselm replied. "The winter was harsh, but they have endured well. And how do the manuscripts fare?" "They also endure," Aelred replied with a smile, "though they require different attention than your fish. The cold has been hard on the binding materials. The leather becomes brittle and must be treated with oils and careful handling. Yet nothing has been damaged irreparably. The texts have survived. They walked together through the library, and Aelred showed Anselm the various manuscripts that Brother William had been copying before his death. The work was beautiful, each letter perfectly formed, the margins perfectly balanced, the entire page reflecting the meticulous care and spiritual intention that William had brought to every task. His last manuscript remains unfinished, Aelred said, showing Anselm a page where the copying ended mid-sentence. Brother Gregory will complete it, but it will be his completion of William's work, not William's own completion. It is strange how death interrupts even the most ordinary labors. All labor is interrupted eventually, Anselm replied, whether by death or by the transition of responsibility to other hands. This is simply the nature of work performed in the context of finite human lives. What matters is that the work continues, even if the individual laborer does not. That night in his cell, Anselm found himself thinking about succession and continuity in a more concentrated way than he had been doing. He was aging noticeably now. The winter had taken a toll on his frame that was becoming increasingly visible to others. He had perhaps another year of full labor capacity remaining to him, possibly two if he was fortunate, and if no serious illness struck. After that, he would need to rely increasingly on Thomas's capacity to manage the fish ponds. Yet this prospect did not trouble him as it might have troubled someone else. He understood that his role was not to work forever, but to work well for as long as he was able, and then to release the work gracefully to others. Thomas was ready, not completely, but ready enough to learn on his own with only occasional guidance. The 14th day brought the first genuinely warm day since autumn had turned to winter. At midday, when the sun reached its highest point, the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in weeks. The effect on the landscape was dramatic. Ice began to melt noticeably. Water began to flow from elevated surfaces toward lower ground, and the entire environment seemed to come alive with activity. Anselm stood at the upper pond and observed this transformation with profound attention. The ice was definitely weakening now. In another week or two, it would begin to break apart along the edges, and by late winter's end, the ponds would likely be open water once more, ready for the resumption of normal summer operations. The fish in the lower pond were responding to the subtle changes in water temperature that even their deep sanctuary could not entirely shield them from. Their movements had become more active, more purposeful. They seemed to sense the approaching season of greater activity and more abundant food. "The ponds are awakening," Thomas observed as he worked alongside Anselm. "I can feel it. The sense of hibernation that has characterized winter is beginning to lift." "Yes," Anselm replied. "In another 2 months or so, we will begin the process of moving the fish back toward the upper ponds. They will disperse into their normal seasonal distribution, and the ponds will resume their full operational capacity. For now, we observe and make small adjustments. Patience remains our primary virtue." That afternoon, Anselm was summoned to the abbot's chambers. The summons was unusual. He rarely had formal meetings with the abbot, and when communication was necessary, it typically occurred in more casual settings. This formality suggested something significant was being discussed. "Brother Anselm," the abbot began when Anselm had been received in his study, "I wish to speak with you privately about your future and the future of the Fishponds. I have been observing you throughout this winter, and it is clear that the work is becoming increasingly demanding for your aging frame. I do not wish you to suffer unnecessarily, nor do I wish for the Fishponds to be compromised by a keeper who is physically unable to perform the work adequately. I remain capable of performing all necessary work," Anselm replied, understanding the concern, but also understanding that this was a delicate moment in the transition of responsibility. "I do not doubt your capability," the abbot said, "but I would like to propose a formal arrangement. Brother Thomas will be named as your successor, effective immediately, though with you retaining authority and primary responsibility for one more season. During that time, he will perform increasingly larger portions of the work under your guidance until by autumn he has assumed complete responsibility. You would then transition to the role of contemplative elder, available for advice and teaching, but not bearing primary responsibility for the daily management of the ponds." Anselm considered this proposal, finding it wise and appropriately structured. "This arrangement honors both the continuity of the work and the reality of my aging," he said. "I accept it gratefully." "I am glad," the abbot replied. "Brother Thomas has proven himself capable, and your training of him has been excellent. The transition will be smooth, I believe, because you have done the groundwork properly." That evening, Anselm found Brother Thomas at the ponds and informed him of the abbot's decision. The young man's face registered surprise, then reflection, then a kind of peaceful acceptance. "I am not certain I am ready," Thomas said quietly. "You are more ready than you believe," Anselm replied. "And readiness will come through the performance of responsibility. This arrangement allows you to grow into the work gradually, with my guidance available but with primary responsibility increasingly resting on your shoulders. By autumn, you will have the confidence that can only come through sustained performance." "What will you do?" Thomas asked, "when you are no longer bound to the daily work at the ponds?" "I will pray," Anselm replied simply. "I will observe. I will teach when teaching is needed. I will live out the remainder of my life in preparation for death, which cannot be far distant now. It is good work, the final form of labor that a monastic life encompasses." The days that followed brought an acceleration of spring's approach. The warming continued, the ice continued to weaken, and the entire landscape began to show the first visible signs that new growth was preparing to emerge. The brothers' spirits seemed to lift perceptibly as the burden of extreme winter began to ease. Brother Gregory made progress on the manuscripts that William had begun, and the copy work continued its slow, meticulous advancement through the pages. Brother Oswin began planning the repairs that would need to be made to various structures after the damage and stress of the winter. Brother Cuthbert began calculating what stores would remain when spring finally arrived, and seeds could be planted for the summer harvest. Anselm and Thomas worked together in a new configuration now, with Thomas performing increasingly more of the primary work, and Anselm providing guidance and oversight. The transition was gradual, as the abbot had suggested, but it was also genuinely effective. Thomas was learning through responsibility rather than merely through observation, and this accelerated his development considerably. One afternoon in late winter, as the first hints of green were becoming visible in the vegetation surrounding the monastery, Anselm found himself standing alone at the Fishponds for what he somehow sensed would be one of the final times that he held complete primary responsibility. The realization was not dramatic or painful. Instead, it brought a quality of peaceful closure. The work he had begun nearly 40 years ago would continue. His successor was ready. The knowledge he had accumulated would be preserved through Thomas's understanding and practice. The ponds themselves would endure, would continue to provide sustenance for the community, would continue to be a place where the principles of patient labor and harmonious stewardship could be learned and practiced. He stood at the edge of the lower pond and looked down into the water where the fish were moving with increasing activity as spring approached. Their existence had been sustained through the winter by his faithful labor. They would soon be distributed back toward the upper ponds and would resume their normal seasonal patterns of activity. And eventually, many of them would provide sustenance for the monastery's table. The cycle continued. The seasons turned. Death and life moved in their eternal dance. And Anselm, having performed his particular role in that vast drama, was now preparing to yield his place to the next performer, secure in the knowledge that the work itself was eternal, and that individual workers were simply temporary vessels for an eternal purpose. The light was beginning its transformation toward evening, and the temperature was dropping as night approached. Anselm made his way back toward the abbey, his footsteps following the path they had followed thousands of times before, his mind at peace with the knowledge of work completed and transition beginning. The afternoon light had begun its slow descent toward the golden hour when Anselm completed his final walk from the Fishponds toward the abbey. The path beneath his feet was familiar beyond measure, not merely memorized, but encoded into his body itself through decades of daily repetition. The ice at the edges of the upper pond was breaking apart now, creating small geometric patterns of opening water. The lower pond, where the concentrated fish had survived the winter, remained mostly frozen on its surface, but beneath that ice, Anselm could sense the stirring of life preparing for the season of greater activity. In another few weeks, the fish would begin their migration back toward the shallower waters, where they would resume their normal patterns of feeding and growth. He paused for a moment at the threshold between the fish ponds and the abbey's main buildings, turning to observe the water one final time in this particular configuration of his labor. The ponds looked exactly as they had looked countless thousands of times before, yet somehow, this observation felt different, weighted with a quality of closure. The evening bells were beginning to ring as Anselm entered the warming room. Brother Thomas was there, warming himself by the fire before the evening meal. The young man looked up as Anselm appeared, and his face arranged itself into an expression of quiet concern. "Your shift will soon be longer than mine," Anselm said, settling himself near the warmth of the fire. By summer, the ponds will be entirely your responsibility. Are you ready?" "I do not know," Thomas replied honestly. "But I understand now that readiness is not something one possesses before beginning. It is something one develops through the work itself." "You have learned well," Anselm said, and the warmth in his voice extended beyond mere words. "Better than many and faster than most. The ponds are fortunate to have you as their next keeper." They sat together in companionable silence, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved gently through the abbey's stone passages, carrying with it the scent of earth beginning to awaken from winter's long sleep. In the refectory, the community gathered for the evening meal. Brother Cuthbert had prepared a soup that was noticeably richer than the provisions of deep winter. Root vegetables combined with some of the stored beans, seasoned with herbs that suggested the approaching season of greater abundance. Anselm ate slowly, as always, tasting each element fully and completely. The other brothers moved through their meal with various degrees of mindfulness, but Anselm had long since learned that the external pace of others did not need to dictate his own pace. He continued to eat in the rhythm that felt truest to his understanding of what eating meant, a form of gratitude, a ritual of nourishment, a moment of full presence and awareness. After the meal, rather than immediately returning to his cell as had become his increasingly common pattern during the late winter, Anselm found himself drawn toward the scriptorium. Brother Gregory was there, alone in the candle-lit space, laboring over the manuscript that William had been copying when illness had claimed him. The young scribe looked up as Anselm entered, and his face registered that particular combination of respect and affection that had become characteristic of how younger brothers now responded to Anselm's presence. "The work progresses?" Anselm asked, observing the page that Gregory had been working on. "It progresses slowly," Gregory replied. "But I have come to understand that the slowness is not an impediment. It is the essence of the work. Each letter requires complete attention. There is no room for haste or distraction." Anselm approached the desk and examined the manuscript more closely. The letters were well formed, the spacing precise, the overall effect reflecting genuine care and spiritual intention. Gregory had learned the lesson that William's decades of labor had been designed to teach, that the value of work lay not in its speed or quantity, but in the quality of attention and intention that it embodied. Brother William would recognize his own understanding in your work, Anselm said. That is the highest compliment one laborer can receive from another, that their understanding has been transmitted successfully to the next generation. That night, Anselm lay in his cell and felt the weight of completion settling over him like a blanket. The winter had been hard, but it had been successfully endured. The Fishponds had survived. The community had survived. Thomas had been prepared to assume responsibility. The broader patterns of labor and succession were unfolding as they should. He thought about death again, as he had been doing with increasing frequency. Death no longer seemed like something distant or frightening. It seemed, rather, like the natural completion of a cycle, the final transformation in a series of transformations that had characterized his entire existence. Sleep came peacefully, and Anselm passed into the deep rest that his laboring body required, his aging frame beginning the process of gradual release that would eventually lead to final release. In the morning, he woke as always before dawn, but this time he remained in his cell rather than immediately proceeding to the fish ponds. There was no immediate crisis requiring attention. The ponds could be tended adequately by others for a morning, and Anselm found that his body was requesting rest rather than labor. He sat by his narrow window and watched the eastern sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to pale gray. The transformation of darkness into light seemed to mirror the transformation that his own life was undergoing, a gradual shift, a slow movement from one state toward another. By the time the community began gathering for morning prayers, Anselm had risen and dressed and made his way to the chapel. He stood with the other brothers as the ancient psalms were chanted, his voice joining in the familiar Latin phrases that had carried him through a lifetime of prayer. The words were the same as they had always been. The melody was the same. The rhythm was the same. Yet something had fundamentally shifted in Anselm's experience of the prayer. He was no longer praying while preparing to labor. He was praying as he was beginning to release labor. The prayer itself had become his primary work now. The seasons would continue their eternal turning. Spring would fully arrive. The fish ponds would return to their normal operations. Brother Thomas would assume complete responsibility for their stewardship. Summer would come with its abundance and its particular demands. Autumn would arrive with its harvest and its preparation for winter. And eventually, another winter would come, and Anselm would experience it from a different perspective. No longer the keeper of the ponds, but a contemplative elder, observing and teaching and preparing for the final transformation that awaited him. All of this would unfold naturally, as things always unfolded when human effort aligned itself with the deeper currents of creation and seasons, and the endless cycle of becoming and release. For now, Anselm simply continued, breathing, praying, moving through the Abbey's daily rhythms with the same attention and presence he had brought to 40 years of labor at the fish ponds. And in this continuing, in this attention, in this presence to each moment as it arrived, the essential work was complete. The light continued its daily cycle. The seasons continued their eternal progression, and Anselm, having become the ponds and the water and the patient work of stewardship itself, rested in the completion of his particular journey, awaiting with peaceful certainty the next transformation that would eventually come.